And for those of you who are joining us from elsewhere in the world, good morning and good afternoon as well. Welcome to the third day of public seminar with the topic Academic Writing for International Publication by Ministry of Research and Technology of Republic of Indonesia, also known as BRIN, along with American Institute for Indonesian Studies, known as IFIS. My name is Pinkani, and I would like to thank you again for joining us on the third day of this workshop. For today, the first session will be led by Paul Nerney with the theme of salient features of publishable academic English. Subsequently, the second session will discuss publishing ethics to be led by Dr. Paul Kratoska. And first of all, allow me to briefly again introduce the facilitators of this workshop. The first one, Paul Nerney. Mr. Nerney designed, taught, and coordinated courses in English as a second language and English as the first school language for the Center for English Language. And more recently, he has conducted writing workshops for graduate degree candidates and junior faculty in Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Indonesia. He is a mentor for the U.S. Social Science Research Council's Global Scholars Initiative. And the second facilitator for today is Dr. Paul H. Kratoska. Dr. Kratoska is Publishing Director and formerly Director of NUS Press at the National University of Singapore. He served on the board of directors of the U.S. Association for Asian Studies from 2003 until 2005 and is past editor of the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies and current editor of the Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. And before I give the floor to the facilitators, allow me to remind all participants to please use the Q&A function to write your questions. Please mention your name and also your institutional affiliation. Please do not ask questions by using the raise hand function as the participant speakers are currently turned off on purpose during the webinar. Sekali lagi, mohon mempergunakan fungsi Q&A untuk menuliskan pertanyaan Anda. Tuliskan nama dan nama institusi Anda. Karena semua speaker partisipan di-mute untuk kepentingan selama webinar, maka kami tidak bisa menerima pertanyaan Anda jika Anda menyampaikan pertanyaan Anda dengan menggunakan fungsi raise hand. And now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Paul Nerney to begin his presentation. Mr. Nerney, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Connie. And well, good evening to everybody in Indonesia, and good morning and good afternoon to people wherever else you are in the world tonight. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen now, so please bear with me for just a second. Okay, that started. Okay, we're ready to start. Well, tonight the talk is Salient Features of Publishable Academic English. You'll notice that my name does not appear here, but rather we see Susan Lopez Nerney. This actually is her talk. Sadly, she's just recovering from an operation, and she currently doesn't have her voice, so she was unfortunately she's been unable to participate actively in this in the seminar series that we have here. But her ideas are very much present with us tonight, as you'll hear. Last night, what I did was I was looking at the selection of information and the organization of that information that makes a manuscript read like a research article as opposed to, for example, a research proposal or a research report or some other kind of genre related to research. And as we saw when we were looking at the introduction, there's very, very specific kinds of information that is integrated in very, very specific kinds of ways, and that there are questions that you can ask of yourself or of somebody else if you're looking at their paper in order to help them to revise the introduction and so forth. So that's what we were looking at last night. Tonight, in a sense, Susan's lecture continues the same thing, except that now we're going to, instead of looking at the selection of information, the organization of information, we're going to be looking at the wording of that information. And you'll see throughout the talk that actually what she presents is a range of things that you can do. And these have been selected because we're fairly confident that these things that we're asking you to do with language are things that you can already do. Susan famously quotes Ken Hyland, who said, and this is absolutely true, academic English is nobody's first language. And what does Hyland mean by that? He means that all of us learn academic English, academic writing in school. We don't learn it anyplace else but school. And it is really, in a sense, a second language to us. I mean, it's a language that we learn not as babies, but something that we learn later on. And we spend our whole lives, especially if we're researchers, we spend our whole lives basically learning and relearning language and how we use that language in order to come up with our own voice. In other words, when somebody looks at a piece, they would say, okay, given this topic, and just given the way that this piece reads, I know who wrote it. So that's what we aim for. We aim for a distinctive voice that at the same time is very, very conventional, that makes the text read like a research article as opposed to some other type of research document. So this is what Susan's going to be, well, what I'll be taking you through in Susan's lecture tonight, okay? So let's take a look at the scope of the lecture. We're looking at the salient features and conventions of publishable academic English. We'll be looking at strategies for achieving these features. We'll be, and then we'll basically the lecture schedule will do this. The first thing we're going to look at is the whole notion of academic English. Exactly what is academic English? Just basically get on the same page. Then there's basically 4 very important things that you need to think about when as you're writing and as you're revising. And the first one of these things is clarity. We'll spend some time to talk about that. There's a break at that point. When we come back from the break, we'll be looking at the notion of cohesiveness and exactly what is cohesiveness? How do we achieve it in a text? And then once again, another break. And then finally, we finish up with consistency and conciseness. All of that is followed by a Q&A session, okay? So the lecture materials here, we have our main lecture slides. There's also handouts for the lecture that these have been given to you. And there's also supplementary grammar materials that we've given you also. Now, the handouts for the lecture and the supplementary grammar materials are largely for things for you to look at. Okay, it's for you to look at these things. You can study them. You can use them to basically revise your papers, essentially. Okay, so they're there for you, and I believe that they've already been distributed to you, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so when we take a look at the language of research papers, what this involves is, it involves writing up your research and using certain conventions that, number 1, structure your arguments. Number 2, match linguistic forms to rhetorical purpose. And when we take a look at this, the first thing we need to look at are the features of publishable academic English. And this involves academic style, as we were just talking about, clarity, cohesiveness, consistency, and conciseness. And most importantly, error-free grammar and mechanics. Okay. Before I start, though, Susan did an evaluation of the 17 papers that we have, and this basically is what she found. In terms of academic style, actually, you guys have a good sense of academic style. The 17 papers that we looked at, you have a good sense of academic style. Yes, there are things that could be improved here, but by and large, you basically get it. However, in terms of clarity and cohesiveness, the papers need work. And this is something that we're going to be focusing on a lot tonight. In terms of consistency, quite okay. You actually do a pretty good job there. And in terms of conciseness, once again, you do get the notion of conciseness, and we can see evidence of conciseness in your papers. However, once again, there are maybe certain things that you need to be looking at when you're revising your paper. Okay, so this is what we're looking at, and we'll be focusing a lot on clarity and cohesiveness tonight, because this is probably where we need to throw our efforts in terms of making your papers readable and hopefully publishable. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look at academic style then. Okay, first of all, when we look at academic style, it's highly conventionalized. It's not free-flowing. There are very definite things we do when we're writing in an academic style. And as we were saying, language forms must match the rhetorical purposes of the things that we're writing. Now, what's interesting about this is that academic style is actually fairly consistent across a wide variety of disciplines. So whether you're in the life sciences or the physical sciences, the social sciences, whether you're in humanities and so forth, it's actually fairly consistent. So what we'll be talking about tonight is really kind of aimed at a wide range of disciplines. Okay, so when we look at this now, the one thing you have to realize about academic style, variations exist. There are many, many stylistic choices that you can choose from. There's not just one style. There are actually stylistic choices. There's a range of these things. Now, some are more frequently used than others. That's one thing to keep in mind. And as you can see here, this frequency ranges from rarely used, to something that's very frequently, almost always used, okay? And the important thing you need to remember here is that because you have these stylistic choices, in the end, you get to choose. If you want something that's more rare or something very frequent, you can do so. But if you choose, you also have to be aware of what it is that you're choosing. And that's what we'll be looking at tonight, the choices that you actually have when you're writing and when you're revising your paper. So first thing to think about in terms of academic style is vocabulary. It's formal. It's not informal. And that means that there are certain verbs that there are certain formal verbs that we use as opposed to informal verbs. There are other parts of speech like adjectives and nouns that make up academic style, and we have choices there. If you are looking at choices, however, that what we are suggesting is that you use the formal alternative as opposed to the informal alternative, okay? And we're going to look at some of these differences in just a moment. So, verbs. Now, let's take a look at this sentence right here. Researchers have come up with a number of models to describe the effects of certain beverages on dental enamel erosion, okay? So we have that. AIDS researchers have run into a wide variety of unexpected problems in their efforts to develop a vaccine, okay? The use of touchscreen voting systems could get rid of many problems associated with paper ballots. Now, if you look at those verbs, what do you actually notice about them? What seems to be common? The verbs in red, what do they seem to have in common with each other? Okay, I'm going to give you the answer now. They basically have multiple words. They're basically verb phrases, right? Come up with, run into, get rid of, okay? Now, these are informal verbs. And if you take a look at this, we can actually change these things. So instead of come up, we can use this. Researchers have proposed a number of models to describe the effects of certain beverages on dental and animal. Or with that second sentence, instead of run into, we can say, AIDS researchers have encountered a wide variety of unexpected problems in their efforts to develop a vaccine, or possibly you could also use the word experienced, right? So we're using single verbs here. Or in the case of the third example here, the use of touch screen voting systems could eliminate many problems associated with paper-based ballots. So what's happening here is by just using the more formal verb, your paper begins to sound more academic, right? And it's simply you're simply using the formal version of these informal verbs. So that's a very, very simple thing you can do. When you write, I think all of you can spot verb phrases as opposed to single verbs. So think about if you're doing that, think about replacing these multi-word verbs with a single, more formal equivalent. Okay, another thing to take a look at here is adjectives. So let's take a look at this. There has been a lot of interest in how background sounds such as music affect an individual's ability to concentrate. Well, instead of saying a lot of, we can say there has been significant interest. Or we have something like this. Consumer interest in electronic billing and payment is getting bigger and bigger. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can also use a much more formal equivalent of this. Interest in electronic billing and payment is increasing. So you can see the same pattern happening here. Okay, now there are other parts of speech as well. Let's take notes, for example. Okay, the thing that bothers most people is the humidity. Instead of saying thing, the factor. So rather than thing, which is kind of a very general word we use to talk about many different things. We use this in speech a lot when we're just speaking informally with friends, but you can also use a more formal word that tends to be more specific in most cases. And it basically, because it's more specific, it gets your reader straight to whatever it is that you want to talk about. And the reader's not left guessing at this in effect. So factor, for example, in this case, or the important thing to include all the stuff in one is important to include all the stuff in one document. So instead of stuff, we can use requirements. It's important to include all the requirements, so forth and so on. Formal vocabulary then, it conveys more accurate and precise meanings, right? That's the first thing it does. That's why we want to use it. It's more concise, and we'll be looking at conciseness later on. It changes the tone of your writing and makes it sound more academic. And it's really, really easy to do. Now, there's, in terms of academic style, there's also 8 other features. I won't really be discussing them tonight, but if you take a look after the lecture at handout 1, this will actually give you a list of things and give you an idea of things that you can do with various parts of speech so that your paper is more formal and achieves an academic ambiance, so to speak, in what you're writing. Okay, well, let's take a look at some of these other things here. I'm just going to. Sorry, there's something getting in the way of my stuff here. Okay, there we go. Okay, when we take a look at academic style, then there's also other features to consider here. So, for example, we can look at the use of direct questions. For example, here's an example of a direct question. Why has antibiotic resistance increased? Well, actually, it's more common to use indirect questions. For example, if you look at the sentence here in green, right? Many studies have investigated why antibiotic resistance has increased, okay? So we have that. So that's something that tends to be more frequently used. It's not that you can't use a direct question, but it's just that questions are more likely to be actually put inside a declarative sentence, okay? Well, with adverbs, for example, it's more often in mid-sentence than in either the initial position of a sentence or the final position of a sentence. Now, why is that the case? That's because you want to bring the adverb closer to the verb that's being modified. So, for example, we have this sentence here. Originally, the model was developed by the IMF, right? Okay. So, what we can do, or we can have this right here. The model was developed by the IMF originally. Yeah. Okay. And both sentences are grammatical. They're right. But it's just that if you bring the adverb closer to the verb, it's actually easier for readers to understand exactly what you're saying. And so here's our example right here. The model was originally developed by the IMF, right? So you have that. That's something to consider when you're doing, when you're revising your paper for wording. Okay, contractions. Contractions are not frequently used in most fields. It's not common. One exception is don't. There's a preference. There's a preference for specific negatives. For example, if we have a sentence like this, the analysis did not yield any new results. Okay, there's, again, nothing absolutely wrong with that sentence. It's fine. However, what we more frequently find is the analysis yielded no new results. It's just, rather than, in a sense, having a longer sentence, we just make the sentences as short as possible, okay? And it's just easier for people to read. The use of I, this a question that often comes up among people when they're first starting out to write, because you see examples of this, especially, for example, in ethnographic writing, where the researcher has gone and lived in a community for 2 years and was the only person there, in a sense. And so, of course, the person's not going to say, this writer did this. There's a tendency to use I. However, in most fields, and if you're a new author, avoid using I, okay? That's, it's again, just generally not done. We have other features like the use of you. For example, you can see the results in table 1. In most fields, many fields, it's avoided and the passive voice is used instead. The result can be seen in table 1. Simply, let's face it, when we're talking about results, as in this example, you are not that important. What's really important is the results. So you focus the sentence on the results, as we see right here. And typically, you, the reader, are not that important, to be honest. In the paper, you're not that central to the paper. So, so there's a tendency to avoid referring to the reader as you. Another thing here, the use of split infinitives. To meet becomes to adequately meet. It's not so common, but quite frankly, it's good to split the infinitive, like we saw here, to adequately meet, because sometimes it avoids awkwardness or simply ambiguity. So you can kind of see this in the next example here. We need to adequately meet the needs of those enrolled in the program. You could easily change that to, we need to meet the needs of those enrolled in the program adequately. So in this case here, you can see the shifting. You can see the shifting of this here, so that you're not breaking up the idea we need to meet. So be aware of those kinds of things. Passive versus active voice. Well, we have this right here. First, viruses are identified. It's used especially when the agent is not the focus. In other words, for that example of you I was just talking about, Instead, what we really, really, really want to focus on is the process that we're describing or whatever's going on, okay? So that's also something to keep in mind. Now, just a little exercise for you here. What I'm going to do is I will not normally when Susan and I are doing this, she will she's facing a live audience and she'll get people to raise their hand and do that. But in this case, we don't have that kind of a situation. But if you see something like this, for example, the model was developed by Krugman originally. Okay, it is unclear, and then we have a directly stated question there. Export figures won't improve until the economy is stronger. Again, the use of the contraction here, which tends to be rather unusual. And you can play with these things if you want. They'll be, I believe that they're in the handouts that you received, right? But so we will just go over that because we have quite a bit to do here. So you can see some of the things we have here. The model was originally developed by Krugman. The model was developed originally by Krugman. So we're keeping the adverb very, very close to the verb, right? Or it's unclear how do, and then we have the direct question there. Well, you can put the direct question inside the declarative sentence. It is unclear how market-driven policies shape higher education. Or we have this right here, we have the won't becomes will not. And so these would be the more frequently kind of uses of these things. Well, let's take a look at clarity then, okay? In terms of clarity, language is clear when the meaning is unambiguous. In other words, there's only one meaning. There's not several possible meanings, but there's only one meaning. And it has become ambiguous because of the language that you've chosen. And it expresses exactly what you want it to say. So when we're talking about clarity, that's what we're talking about. Unambiguous wording, and the wording is saying what you want it to say, not what somebody else wants it to say or what you think somebody else wants you to say, but it's what you want to say. So there are certain problem areas in your papers now that Susan spotted, and I'll start to take a look at some of these kind of more common areas. The first thing is in making claims, okay? And if you remember, Paul Kotorska was talking about this on the first night here, where a claim is something that you have to show is so, right? So in other words, you don't expect your readers to take this at face value. A claim is something you have to explain it. You have to show that there is a factual basis for it in your data, right? And the other problem area is when you're evaluating, especially other people's research, okay? And that's a problem area as well. So let's take a look at qualifications and strengths of claims, okay? So what we're going to aim at here is to be confidently uncertain. Now, why is that the case? Well, let's face it. I mean, when you make a claim, chances are in research, very rarely are we 100% absolutely certain that something is so. So there's always an element of uncertainty. And so what you have to be aware of is there are linguistic resources that express caution or that, in other words, moderate your claims. Okay, so we'll take a look at these. Now, there's 5 ways to moderate claims, and yet at the same time, still be confident that you are indeed factually accurate, even if not 100%. It's called hedging. That's the informal way of looking at moderating claims. Okay, that's the word for that. Okay. Now, one thing you can use is you can state probability, and this involves the use of modal verbs. Okay. The second thing you can do is you can distance yourself, or you can show that your data is soft in some way. Okay. And you can also soften generalizations. You can also use weaker verbs. And you can use a combination of all four of these things as well. It's possible to combine them. So let's take a look at then moderating claims, okay? Okay, and this involves the use of probability modal verbs. So if we look at this sentence right here, sleeping 7 to 9 hours each day results in better academic performance. If you're using the verb results, what you're saying is this is true 100% of the time. There are no exceptions to this. There's no possibility that you would have a poor academic performance if you slept 7 to 9 hours a day. And if you think about that, that's very unlikely. So you need to modify it. You need to state probability. So you can use can result, could result, may result, might result. You can use these modal verbs to basically show that whatever it is I'm talking about, it's probably true, but not necessarily all the time. You can also distance yourself or show that data is soft, and you do it this way. So right here we have a sentence. Health education has a positive impact on the patient's quality of whatever that is. Now, there's different ways we can do this. And we can use seems to have a positive impact. It seems that health education, so forth and so on. It would appear that health education and so forth, okay? So there are ways of distancing yourself from from the claim by doing these things like this, by using these types of structures. Seems, would appear. Okay. Now, here's another thing we can kind of look at. Based on the limited data available, the African continent has, okay, according to this preliminary study, so forth and so on, based on previous surveys. In other words, it's not me, but it's previous surveys that have done this. Okay, it's not me, but it's a preliminary study that's making this claim. It is me, but my data is frankly limited because that's all that was available, right? So you can do things like this. Now, generalizations. This is something that you need to take note of because this is a problem in many of your papers, okay? Okay, now, remember we saw sleeping 7 to 8 hours a day results in better academic, so forth and so on. We had this other sentence, health education has a positive impact on a patient's quality of, so forth. Well, what we're seeing here in the case of the verb results and the verb has, this is the so-called simple present tense. Now, to be honest, this tense is not simple and it doesn't even have much to do with the present. But what it does do, it's really all about saying that the claim I'm making has no variation to it. It is always true. It was always true in the past. It's true now, and it will continue to be true in the future. That's a huge claim that you're making. And oftentimes, and you guys are doing this in your papers, oftentimes when you're doing this, you are overclaiming. You have a generalization that permits no possible alternative. And oftentimes we just don't have the data that would even remotely suggest that, okay? So you need to soften your generalizations, and many of you need to really think very carefully about doing this. You need to go through your paper and look at those so-called simple present tense verbs that you're using. Okay, so let's see how this is done. Well, here's a sentence. Children living in poverty do poorly in school. Once again, you see that verb do. It's admitting no other possibility than to do poorly, right? You can use tend. Children living in poverty tend to do poorly in school. So that permits the possibility that maybe some children living in poverty who actually do averagely, they do average at least, and possibly even, exceed most of the other students in their performance. You can also qualify the subject. Okay, let's look at how that's done. A majority of children living in poverty do poorly in school. So there you're looking at that. You're looking at the subject of your sentence, and you can use words like majority, or you can cite exceptions. With the exception of those enrolled in specialized programs, children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can cite exceptions. So you have these three ways of softening generalizations, and make sure you're doing that when necessary. Okay, there's a fourth way. Now, using weaker verbs. As you know from yesterday, I don't like the use of strong and weak, but Susan doesn't mind that so much. So, but we can see some good examples of exactly what weak verbs are and strong verbs are here. So here we have a sentence, and it says, many studies have concluded that excessive credit growth caused global financial crisis. Okay, so what we're saying here, one thing, excessive credit growth caused the global financial crisis. In other words, the use of the word caused is telling us that there was one cause and one cause only, right? That obviously wouldn't be the case. Global financial crises tend to be caused by usually a number of different things. And so we could say something like this. Many studies have concluded that excessive credit growth contributed to the global financial crisis. And therefore, what we're doing here is we're leaving that, yes, we are focusing on excessive credit growth, but we're also leaving the possibility that there were other causes as well, right? So you can basically moderate your claim doing this. In other words, in a sense, you're weakening the verb in the sense, that you are admitting, you're saying, I think this is important, but there may be other things as well, right? Okay, if you take a look at lecture handout 2 later on, then you'll see lots of examples of how to do this. I won't go into all of them, but take a look at that, because it's a very useful handout to help work with verbs that tend to basically say one thing and one thing only, and there are different ways to work around that and still sound confident, like you know what you're talking about, right? Okay, now you can use a combination of these different strategies that that I've been showing you, and so, but you do need to avoid excessive moderation. And in a few of the papers, we get hints of these things. Now, it's not quite as excessive as this, but if you look at the sentence, you can see how it gets a little bit crazy. Okay, it could be concluded that some evidence seems to suggest that at least certain villages might not have traded their pottery with others in the community. Well, I mean, if you start to moderate things that much, it's very hard to think about. So, well, what were these villages doing anyway? I mean, we don't seem to have any idea of anything they were doing. So the sentence is not really saying a whole lot there, right? So you want to avoid excessive moderation. Okay, once again, take a look at handout 3. This will give you a lot more examples to look at in terms of dealing with excessive moderation. Okay, the other thing now we're looking at, aside from moderating claims and and making sure that whatever data you have will actually support the claim. There's also evaluating, and especially when we're evaluating other people's work, okay, that we get things like this. There's something you have to remember, actually, okay? You need to exercise good judgment in formulating an evaluation and giving it. And we'll see some examples of this now in a while. Because your attitude, whether it's a positive attitude or a negative attitude, is reflected in your choice of language. And so you've got to pay close attention to your language when you are actually evaluating an idea, somebody else's work, etc. Okay. So here's an example, just using uncertain versus flawed, okay? Or remarkable versus interesting, okay? Okay. Now, carefully chosen language can contribute to a reader's willingness to accept your claims and your opinions, and that's actually what's really important about this. Though you want to make sure that you're not alienating your reader, and saying things that put them off. Okay. So in our samples here, you could say, if you say uncertain, that's probably much better than going for the jugular and saying that something is flawed. Or if you say something is remarkable versus interesting, probably better to use interesting than remarkable. Remarkable carries certain negative tones that you may or may not mean, but you want to avoid judging too quickly. So something to notice here, okay, that if you use highly emotive language, this is going to reduce people's perceptions of your objectivity and consequently the credibility of your paper. Okay, so that's really what's at stake here. So we need to be careful with this a bit. So how can you soften criticism? Well, one thing is you can use contrasting adjectives. Let's see how this works. So you might say, in this ambitious but flawed study, the author attempts to show that domesticated animals are, so forth and so on. Or you could do something like this. In this flawed but ambitious study, the author's attempt to show that domesticated animals are. Okay, so you can do this. You can use contrasting adjectives. It's sometimes interesting to think about which one, if people were talking about your study, would you prefer ambitious but flawed, or would you prefer flawed but ambitious? It's very interesting to get people's ideas on this. Unfortunately, tonight we can't play around with this, but the use of the contrasting adjectives anyway, it takes the sting out of basically what's probably going to be a criticism of a piece of previous research, right? So there's actually something else. There's a second one we can look at here, and this has to do with what are called adversitives. So you can use the word although. You can use it in a clause. Okay, although the authors suggest that journal articles written in languages other than English may have a limited impact, he fails to recognize that they may be important at the regional level. So once again, I mean, this is obviously, it's obviously a criticism of somebody's work. He fails to recognize, right? But at the same time, the writer of the criticism is saying, well, okay, there's something interesting that this author is doing. Okay, he's framed it in a kind of an interesting way. Nevertheless, it's not working very well. So trying to point out something that at least may have merit or may have value to it, as well as something that doesn't. Another way you can do this is that the author suggests that journal articles written in languages other than English may have a limited impact. However, he fails to recognize that they may be important at the regional level. So you can see, again, another way of using these adversitives. Although and however, do this, okay? Okay, now we have clarity here. This is a problem area with some of the things that you're doing here. So we've seen here that clarity is involving making claims. It's involving evaluating. And with that, it's now time to take a 5-minute break, okay? You've been quite patient, I think. And so let's take a 5-minute break. So can we meet at well, by my watch it's 8:25, but I think 7:25 would be for those of you in Indonesia. And for the rest of you in other places in the world, I'll let you figure it out for yourself. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nani. So to our participants, we are having a 5 minutes break. During the break, maybe you can try to write your questions in the Q&A function. So we can read all the questions later in the Q&A session at the end. So before we go back to the presentation, I would like to remind all participants once again to please use the Q&A function to write your questions, and don't forget to mention your name and your institutional affiliation. Mohon mempergunakan fungsi Q&A untuk menulis pertanyaan Anda, cantumkan juga nama dan nama institusi Anda. Okay, Paul, I think it's 7. You can start again.
Yes, ma'am, I will. She's very, very strict, isn't she? Yes. Okay. By the way, I was just looking at the Q&A offerings here, and the questions I've seen so far, they're very, very interesting questions, and I look forward to answering some of them. You've raised some very interesting issues about language there. So you guys obviously are listening here, so that's excellent. Okay, let me just share my screen then. Let me get back to that, and then we'll continue.
Yeah, sure.
We'll continue with this. Here we go. Share. And okay, so when we were last looking here, we were looking at the break and everything, and let's just see where we've gotten to. So far, what we've done is we've looked at academic English and clarity. We've had our break. So the next thing we're going to start looking at now is cohesiveness. Okay, so that's another something else that we really need to look at quite closely, as well, as I was saying earlier. Let's say, okay, so cohesiveness, what is that? Well, ideas in a text should cohere. In other words, they need to be clearly connected to each other. That's when we talk about cohesiveness. It's a technical term, but what it means is ideas need to be connected together throughout the whole text. And once again, language is going to play a very important part in doing that, right? So clear connections help your reader to follow your argument easily. And the language should convey the relationship or the connection between ideas clearly and precisely. So that's essentially what we've that's essentially what we need to look at here. So how do we achieve connection between ideas, and what do we mean by clearly and precisely? Well, let's take a look at that. Okay, you can also look at connection of ideas in terms of kind of flow. So let's just take a look at this for fun. Okay, lasers have found widespread application in medicine. Lasers play an important part in the treatment of eye disease and the prevention of blindness. The eye is ideally suited for laser surgery. Most of the eye tissue is transparent. Okay, all those sentences are grammatical, but there's something about the connection of the eye. There's something about these ideas that they're not connecting. They're not connected together. We can figure out the connections, I think, but the problem is that you don't want to make your reader connect the ideas for you. You want to put the connections in there for them so that they can follow your argument. It's not a case that you're trying to tell them what they have to think. It's not that at all. But what you're saying is, this is what I think, and I want to make what I think clear to you. And of course, readers then have they have the choice to accept or not to accept the argument that you're making. So you're not taking anything away from them by basically saying, well, here's what I think. Here's how I think things are connected, right? So you might get something like this instead. Lasers have found widespread application in medicine. For example, they play an important role in the treatment of eye disease and the prevention of blindness. The eye is ideally suited for laser surgery because most of the eye tissue is transparent. So right there, we have this connected. It's easy to see where it's easier to see where the read is going in text number 2 than it is in text number 1. So when we talk about connection of ideas, flow, if you wish, then this is what we're talking about. And let's see how this is achieved. Now, if we looked at this one right here, we saw the first sentence starts off as it started off. Lasers have found widespread application in medicine. For example, they. So the next thing is coming up. It's basically a connection of a claim, and then there's an example of the claim. Okay, it's being illustrated. Okay. For example, they play an important role in the treatment of eye disease and prevention of blindness. The eye is ideally suited for laser surgery because, so we're basically looking at an effect and a cause here, right? So we're connecting these ideas in various ways. And then, aside from those things, we're looking at the use of prepositions here, the things in green, and they're also connecting things together, right? Lasers have found widespread applications in medicine. So the idea of medical science and the use of lasers is being connected together by that word in. For example, they play an important role in the treatment of what? Of eye disease and the prevention. What kind of prevention? Of blindness, right? The eye is ideally suited, suited in what way, how, what? For laser surgery, because most of the eye tissue is transparent. So you can see how those prepositions are also doing this. So we have exemplification, we have cause effect, and we have basically just these prepositions saying how two things go together. Medicine, for example, widespread application. Role, treatment of what? Eye disease. Prevention of what? Blindness, and so forth and so on. Okay, now ways of achieving cohesiveness then, right? Okay, we have transition words, and these are linking words or phrases, and we have prepositions, as I was saying. The second thing is we also have punctuation, right? Now, if you take a look at lecture 4, lecture handout 4, this is going to show you it's a whole list basically of transition words and also the use of punctuation. It will explain this for you. I mean, I think it's self-explanatory. I don't necessarily need to go through all of this in great detail, but do take a look at that handout, okay? And it'll give you different examples of how to do things. Okay, so ways of achieving this right here. Well, basically, we'd like to focus now on prepositions here a little bit, okay? And okay, there it is. And so let's take a look at that right here. We've redone that. Now we have the transition words and we have the linking words and prepositions. There's something else in punctuation, okay? But there's something else that I want you to look at, because this actually is important for your paper. We're pretty much. You're okay with the transition words and the punctuation. They can be problematic, but they're not that problematic. What is very problematic and gets in the way of you achieving cohesiveness in your papers is what we call the NOI pattern, the new to old information pattern. And I want to take a look at this for a while with you. Okay. What the new to old pattern is, it's a backwards reflection of information that has been previously given. In other words, it's now known information in your text, okay? And when we take a look at the NOI strategies, what we can see is the one way to create these NOI patterns is to shift from the indefinite article. This is basically and where and and don't occur, and to the definite article the. It's also the repetition of information, and you can repeat information either verbatim or you can paraphrase it. In other words, it's the use of synonyms or variation on parts of speech. We'll be taking a look at that in a minute. There's also the use of appropriate pronouns. There's the use of summary words, and there's the use of the past participle. So let's take a look at each of these in order then, okay? So articles, definite, indefinite articles, and definite articles, okay? The dog chased a cat. The cat ran into a hole, okay? This is an example of what we're looking at right here. So you can see cat. Now, it was new information before a cat. That's signaling new information. The cat, you already you already know which cat I'm talking about. It was the cat that got chased by the dog, right? But it ran into a hole. A hole is new information. We don't know about that yet. It's going to have to be explained later on. So when we're talking about this noise strategy and shifting from indefinite to definite articles, this is what we're talking about. That's why the shift occurs, because in some cases you're introducing information for the first time in a text. Okay, a cat, and then once having mentioned it once, I can then shift to the cat. I can start giving you more information about the cat if I need to. Okay. Okay, here we go. The hole was huge and dark. So we see the shift from a hole to the hole. Well, here's another one right here. The man was seen walking into the building at 4 p.m. that afternoon. The man was carrying a big black bag. So once again, you can see the shift here in that example, right? Or you can repeat information. This is a second strategy that's oftentimes used. So right here, and once again, we're looking at either verbatim or paraphrase, synonyms or variation of a part of speech that's repeating an idea, okay? And we can see it right here. So here's an example of what we see. We can look at the word caffeine, for example, or variations on caffeine. Researchers have shown that caffeine does indeed reduce sleeplessness and can lead to better academic performance, since students can spend more time studying. Despite its effectiveness in counteracting sleepiness, caffeine can have a negative impact on subsequent sleep, which for many students may already be compromised. However, a new type of caffeinated drink, and it moves on that way. So you can see as you're repeating certain key ideas, or I call them core ideas, right? As you repeat these ideas, then this helps to create cohesiveness in the text. Okay. Oftentimes, many students feel that they need to, and for that matter, teachers as well feel that they need to use a different word every single time they're talking about something. And I think that actually comes from when we were in primary school and maybe secondary school, where we were expected to show off a wide vocabulary. And so we were encouraged on examinations to, even though we're talking about the same idea, use a different word for it. That is so confusing. You do not want to actually do that. It's really, really bad advice. It's a bad teaching strategy in primary and secondary schools. I mean, I don't mean to slime people. I probably should be moderating my claims at this point, but it really causes a lot of problems. And you should not be afraid of repeating certain key ideas verbatim, because it will not sound like you're dumb or so forth, okay? You don't need to worry about that. Okay, there's the third strategy also is using appropriate pronouns. And so, here's an example of that, going back to our example that we're looking at this, okay, that we've been looking at. Research has shown that caffeine does indeed reduce sleeplessness and can lead to better academic performance, since students can spend more time studying. Despite its effects counteracting sleeplessness, caffeine can have a negative impact on subsequent sleepiness. So we can use pronouns to actually create coherence. So when you say, despite its effectiveness, so you say, well, what effectiveness are we talking about? And almost immediately, the word caffeine comes back. Caffeine's effectiveness. So you can see how this pattern works to do that. Okay. Use of summary words. Let's take a look at that. Okay. Now, nouns that refer back to an idea that has been given previously. That's what we're talking about when we mean summary words. Okay. So, and it's either used with this or these. These tend to be very common summary words. Okay. So let's take a look at this. The environmental degradation in China is serious. This problem needs to be addressed. So we've taken this whole first sentence, the idea in this whole first sentence, the environmental degradation of China is serious. Now, at this point, we say it's evaluated as a problem. And it's not just a problem, but we're talking about this problem. The word this says that whole first sentence, I'm referring to that whole first sentence, and I am calling it a problem, which needs to be addressed, right? So you can see how ideas are being linked here that way. Okay, here's the second one. Foreign students in English universities need to be able to speak and write well in English. Some of them find it difficult to fulfill these requirements. So there's a requirement to speak, there's the requirement to write well in English, okay? And once again, we can summarize that idea, those key ideas in the first sentence by using the word requirement, but we also have to refer back using these to say that I'm not talking about any new requirements. I'm talking about something I've already talked about in the last sentence. So, attach the meaning of being able to speak well and the meaning of being able to write well in English to this word requirement in this text. That's what you're saying to people, in effect. Okay, and then this is the use of the past participle. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so we're looking at this right here, this example. Each virus strain has grown separately inside the eggs, over a course of several days, after which it is harvested, inactivated, and purified. The purified virus strains are then combined to create the vaccine. So you can see what's happened here. The writer has kind of keyed in, okay, focused in on this notion of purified, connects it to virus strains, and then goes on to tell us what happens. What happens to the virus strains? They're combined to form vaccine. So, in terms of the noise strategies, then we can see a shift from the indefinite article to the definite article. We've seen the use of repetition of information, either by paraphrasing or quoting things verbatim. We've seen the use of pronouns for doing this. We've seen the use of summary words, and now the use of the past participle. Okay, so here's a sample NOI pattern right here. I think we've gone through this already, and we are starting to be a little bit late for time, so I'm just going to pass over this a bit, okay? Okay, let's take a look then at cohesiveness. Okay, now cohesiveness is achieved through, this is the way it's achieved, through transition words and linking words. We've seen that. Punctuation, we didn't actually see that. That is in the handout that I was referring to earlier because I think it's self-explanatory. And then the use of the NOI pattern. Okay, there is an exercise that we've provided for you here. You can do this on your own. Okay, you can do this on your own. If you have any questions about this, you can always write to either Susan or I. I believe you should be able to get our emails from IFAS, and IFAS will give them to you. We're happy to talk to you. So you can work on this and just you can play with it just a little bit to see what happens. Okay. We have a break here at this point, but I think I'm going to just move straight on. So in the interest of time. Okay. So. Right now, what we've done then is we've taken a look at academic English, clarity, cohesiveness, and now I'd like to go on to the last two things, consistency and conciseness. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, when we look at consistency, what we're doing is looking at a number of things, the variety of English that you're using. And one of the big examples tends to be American versus British English. Quite frankly, I don't think this has been this is actually a big problem in your papers. We didn't really see this, but just to point it out to you quickly anyway, is some of this has to do with terminology. Some of this has to do with terminology. Some of it has to do with perspectives of verb tense. That one I want to pay attention to. Okay, that third one in particular. Okay, so just very quickly, let's look at American versus British English. Which one is better? American, for example, spelling behavior with the V-I-O-R at the end, or British with the V-I-O-U-R at the end. Well, neither one is neither is better than the other. The only thing is that if you decide to use American spelling, then you need to do that consistently through. You shouldn't be switching between British and American spelling. Okay, that's all. Or if you decide on British spelling, then you shouldn't switch. You shouldn't switch that either. You shouldn't switch to American and then switch back to British spelling. Okay, so you just need to be aware of that. Be consistent. Punctuation things. Well, once again, in a series of things like A comma, B comma, and C comma. That's American. The British is A comma, B and C. So the comma does not come after the second item in the series of things that you're talking about. So once again, keep the punctuation stable. Okay. Okay. And of course, vocabulary. Americans say elevators, British say lifts. Once again, don't switch between them, essentially. Okay, so that's enough said, I think. Okay, terminology now, key ideas. Let's take a look at that. Here we have an example of somebody doing what I was talking about before, key idea, but switching, okay? Insomnia can be defined as inadequate or poor sleep based on the quality of sleep, the number of times a person wakes up at night, the length of time of sleeping time, and the length of time spent awake at night. Sleeplessness can be transient or chronic, okay? There's no reason why you can't use insomnia again. I mean, that's your key. That's a key term. It's a key term that you're going to be using again and again and again as you talk over. So there's really no sense in shifting to using another word at this point, especially if insomnia happens to be your key word. And it sometimes just confuses people as well when you do that. So don't do it, basically. So, and as I was saying, here's the example right here. Just you can repeat key terms, and you will not look like you're simple-minded or that, and people will not get bored by reading what you're reading. They'll thank you for it, because the idea is when you switch the wording of key ideas, of key terms, what you're signaling is, okay, I was using insomnia in one way, but now I'm no longer going to use that. We need to switch to something else, sleeplessness. And if you're not really switching to something else, if you're not switching to a new idea or something, it can be very confusing for people. So don't do it. Okay, I'd like to take a look at sequence of tenses now, because this is something that you need to think about for your own papers. Okay. Okay. So we have something like this right here. Human beings make mistakes. Sometimes we did things we regretted. Okay. Well, why are we switching that? It seems unmotivated. Well, this one right here. So you would probably do something like this. Human beings make mistakes. Sometimes we do things that we regret. Okay. So you have that going on. So you want to keep your tenses even. Okay, but we do see examples of inconsistent verbs tense sequence, and we can get things like this right here. Okay, for example, to reduce state responsibility in housing provisions, she sold off state subsidized council housing with a very significant one-off subsidy to sitting tenants. Thus, she transformed many households into homeowners, but subsequently she drove those who are unable to purchase houses to residential units of the worst quality housing. So right here we have this problem where where the writer has been using the past tense, sold, transformed, drove, and all of a sudden, for no good reason, is switching to the present tense, right? And it's again, it gets confusing here. So basically, you'd want to take that R that we saw right there, and we want to change that to were, so that everything's consistent, because we're talking about something that happened in the past, and so we want to keep it in the past. Now, that said, yes, do keep verb tense within a text consistent, unless there's a reason to shift, and there are reasons to shift. Let's just take a look at this one. This one right here. One quality that helps students to succeed in their studies is self-discipline. This characteristic is particularly important in university. In the 2 years that I have lived in the dormitory, I have learned, you notice that the tense is now shifting here, right? I have learned a great deal about self-discipline by observing my roommate, Yuki. Every night before she goes to bed, Yuki plans her time. She writes down what she has to do the next day. Yuki is very disciplined. As a result, she is always able to accomplish much more than I can. One night, again, shifting here, right? One night last semester, I invited her to go out to dinner, but she refused because she had not finished her homework. Next semester, I will make an effort to discipline myself. Okay, so you can see now this of course is a piece of narrative in one sense, or mostly narrative, and some of the narrative happened in the past. Some of it is happening. Some of it's happening in the present moment. Okay, but you can see you can shift tense, but there has to be a reason. Also, notice in the what shall I call it? In these adverbial phrases here, that we have time markers, and the time markers are making this shift from present to past, and also to the future, like next semester here. They're making this shift in time very, very, very clear, and then we have no trouble being able to follow the shift in tense because of that. Okay, so let's take a look at sequence of tenses here. So now here's an interesting thing, and this is directly connected to the things you're writing. Jones, 1997, found illiteracy was correlated most closely with poverty. Oh, here's a different one. Jones, 1997, found that illiteracy is correlated most closely with poverty. What's the difference here? Because there is a difference. Both these sentences are correct, but they have very, very different meanings. If we look at this first one here, that Jones found illiteracy was correlated, what we're saying here, what we are in fact saying here, is that Jones's finding is only related to his evidence. In other words, he's making a claim here, but it's only about the people, whoever they were, that he was studying, or the situations that he was studying. It's only about those things. It is not about situations that he was not studying. So that's what that means when you're using found was. When we start to use this found is, what is happening here is that Jones is claiming that illiteracy is correlated most closely with poverty in all situations. So it's a very, very different claim. He's not just talking about the situation or situations he was studying, but he's talking about all situations. So it's a big difference. So, and if you're writing, I mean, if you're, for example, doing a literature review and you're doing this, you're not careful with your tenses, you can actually make make another researcher say something that researcher is not saying. So you got to watch that very, very carefully when you're switching tenses here. Okay. Okay. Well, let's take a look at consistent. Well, we've looked at consistency here. We've looked at basically variety of English used, American versus British English. We've looked at terminology. We've looked at perspective of tenses. I'd like to move now on to conciseness. And well, let's take a look at this right here. It may be difficult to make a decision about a method that should be used. Okay. Choosing the proper method may be difficult. There are some inorganic materials that can be used in tissue engineering by bioengineers. In the process of tissue engineering, that has been shown to be very promising, versus some inorganic materials have shown great promise in tissue engineering. So conciseness obviously is all about the number of words that you're using, but you can say it one way in a fairly large number of words, or you can say exactly the same thing without any serious loss of meaning with fewer words. And quite frankly, I mean, in writing research papers, especially research articles, the shorter the better. So let's take a look at this. So the idea of conciseness is use as many words as you need to express your ideas clearly, but don't use too many words, okay? And what this is all connected with is spoken versus written style. We'll see some examples of that in just a minute, okay? So when we take a look at this, 1 and 2 in my in the left-hand column, this is the way we talk. In the right-hand column, this is the way we speak. And the difference is this: when people are listening to each other, we need to really spread information out in longer sentences because we only have our ears. We're processing information orally through the ears, okay? Through sound. And for that to happen, if we string out information in longer sentences, although the sentence is grammatically more complex, it gives time for people to be able to connect the ideas together. Now, on the other hand, with writing, what we're doing is we're looking at the sentence. We're not hearing the sentence. We're looking at the sentence, and we can really actually afford to make the sentences grammatically simpler, but they become what's called lexically dense. The meanings are packed together, but that's okay because people can read. If they're looking at the sentence, they can read the sentence either fast or slow. It makes no difference because they're controlling the rate at which they're processing information. When we're speaking, we can't really. It's very, very hard to stop somebody and say, "Oh, what did you mean?" And if you keep doing that, it breaks down communication. So as a result, what we do is we tend to use longer sentences, but it becomes lexically sparse. The important ideas are spaced apart, so people have a chance to make sense of what's being said. Okay, so that's the reason why you can be concise. It's not that one is better than the other, but that's why you can be concise when you're writing as opposed to when you're speaking. Okay, so when you're reviewing and editing your writing, lack of conciseness, in other words, sentences that are long, could lead to grammatical problems and or misunderstanding. And the best thing you can do here is really ask help from a knowledgeable friend. And you notice Susan has put knowledgeable, she's bolded it here. Make sure that they know what they're doing, a knowledgeable friend or a colleague, right? And the other thing you can do here, this is something we don't get into too much, but really consider using visuals, in other words, tables or graphs or photographs instead of text. Sometimes that will make information much, 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 much clearer than trying to describe things as such. Excuse me. So anyways, remember, that basically that you need to you need to maintain an academic style. That style needs to be clear. It needs to be cohesive. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be concise. And most of all, it needs to be grammar-free and error-free from grammar in its grammar and mechanics. Okay, with that, I'm going to say good luck to everybody. Thank you for listening. And now we can, I think, switch to questions. You'll see in the slides that we've given you, there are sources here. Swales and Feek are especially very, very good. You should, I'm pretty sure you can probably find this in your libraries, okay? So, take a look at that in particular. Well, once again, good luck. There's some other references for you to look at. Susan has provided here for you, okay? Okay, so time for Q&A. So let me stop
Thank you,
sharing.
Mr. Ernie.
You're welcome, yes.
Okay, then we will now begin the question and answer session.
Okay.
I'll begin with the first question that came from Yuni Ratnawati from Stikom, Yogyakarta. The question is, do you think Grammarly and Quillbot can help in using academic style writing?
Yes, but, okay. That's what and so I want to talk about the but. Yes, these are actually quite good. They will not catch everything, however, but they will definitely help using them. So I would say by all means, you can take a piece of writing and put it through Grammarly. Grammarly is quite good, and there's a number of other things that you can use as well that work pretty well. Yeah. So yeah. By all means, do that. And of course, you can always use Microsoft Word's grammar checker. I mean, that's also a very, very big help. Grammarly, however, will do a bit more for you than just a grammar checker. I mean, it does. So yeah. Feel free to use those. Feel free to use those things. Yeah.
Okay. For the second question, came from Nurdiana from University of Bunda Mulia, Jakarta. The question is, some friends of mine prefer using Google Translate to writing the paper in English. They write the papers in Indonesian, then translate them into English using the Google Translate. What do you think about this? Would it be okay as long as the articles are readable? Okay, that's the answer.
That's the answer. Yeah. Now let me give you the reason. Okay, that's my claim. So let me give you the reason.
Yeah.
Google Translator will actually mistranslate what you're saying, because oftentimes what you're doing is you're probably making a somewhat complex argument in what you're saying, and Google Translator does not pick that up. If you're doing very, very, very simple kinds of things, it's okay. It's not great. It's okay. But with especially academic papers, it's really death. I mean, it literally will not make sense. It results in basically nonsense. I mean, it's lexical well, the technical term is lexical miscollocation. The words don't go together. I mean, one very famous example of lexical miscollocation is this: colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That's a perfectly grammatical sentence. It makes absolutely no sense. And often, in fact, actually, to be honest, I suspect many of our 17 people, at least some of them, have used this, because you're writing sentences that actually are like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. I mean, they're making absolutely no sense whatsoever. So I would be very, 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 very careful using Google Translator. Okay, or if you do use it, be prepared to go through it the sentence by sentence very, very carefully, basically using the things that Susan was showing you in this talk that I've just given you. That will help to straighten out things. But let's put it this way: you're going to have to straighten it out yourself. Do not depend on Google Translator to do a good job for you. It will actually it will result in lexical miscollocation, and you'll sound like a crazy person. Colorless green ideas. Yeah, really. Okay, I know I'm messing around here, and but I am trying to make a serious point. Okay,
Yeah.
yes. What else do we have?
Yeah.
Honey?
The next question. I think, okay, this one. Does writing for international publication need variation style, like using inverted sentences, combination passive and active, etc., or is it better to make all sentences in similar pattern?
Yeah, I know. I know what you're saying there, and I'm very, very torn. I'm very torn between this. If you're using a particular sentence pattern because you think it makes you sound more scholarly, more academically, uh, whatever, don't do that. I mean, use the you want a style that the style is simple, but it's capturing the complexity of the ideas that you have. That's what you really want. You want kind of a simple grammatical style in general, but at the same time, you are really capturing the complexity and of the ideas that you're talking about, especially the complexity of the relationship between ideas. So, having an inverted sentence, for example, it won't capture, it will not capture complexity of the ideas. It won't do that. In fact, it may make something look more complex than it really is, or it may make it look very complex, but in actual fact, it is not really describing and explaining the complexity that you have found, for example, in your data. So think about using a simple style, but think about using that simple style to focus on the complexity of things, the way that they have, the way that they interlock together, or the way that they're clashing together, or the way that they're missing each other when they should be kind of connecting together. That's the kind of thing that you want to. That's the kind of thing you want to capture. It's the connections, or the clashing, or the tension. Where they're pulling against each other. There's a tension between the ideas, and that's what you're trying to capture. Okay. So however you do that, that's fine. But I would say, that's my son. I really apologize. I'm
It's
going
okay.
to shut him
It's
off.
okay, Paul.
Yeah. Mark, I'm in the middle of a lecture. Call back later.
Oh, okay. Call me. Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Good. Children. Anyways, that's the problem with being at home. Okay. Anyways, yeah. So that's So that's pretty much what I'd have to say. You can use any style you want, but keep the style as simple as you can. But also always be focused on the complexity of things. That's what you really want to. That's the thing you want to highlight. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Okay, the next question came from Bonar Hutapea from Universitas Tarumanegara. The question is, in the case of avoiding similarity might be detected by similarity checker as alleged plagiarism, isn't it reasonable and therefore acceptable if we sometimes use informal phrase or vocabulary in our sentences?
You can. I'd be interested in seeing maybe some examples of where you might do that. For example, I mean, I can think of a couple of things. For example, when somebody's going out and they've worked with informants, okay, and they're doing especially ethnographic kinds of studies, and they're trying to capture the way that this person speaks because they're trying to represent not just what they was the ideas that they were coming forth, but they're also trying to capture the way that they're speaking. And so, if the person was actually talking in a very informal way, then yeah, I mean, in a case like that, I would say fine, do that. But I think normally when we're presenting research, that is a formal situation, and generally, we try to do these things. We try to do these things in a formal way. So I would really go to that side of formality rather than trying to go out of my way to be informal, unless I say there's a good reason for that, and I give you that one example that kind of came to my mind. Yeah, so it needs to be motivated. It needs to be motivated in such a way that informality somehow captures the complexity of whatever it is that you're talking about. Think about it in that term. And I notice Paul Kotorska has come in. Paul, whenever you feel like cutting in, by all means. Okay.
Okay. So, I'll come in about that point because.
Okay, I knew you wanted to.
Well, you don't want to be overly formal. And because you get in trouble trying to write that way. But if you're being overly casual, and I guess the way I would look at this, I mean, there's all these sort of everyday ways of speaking in Singapore that's English, and it's not really going to work very well in an academic paper. So the best thing when you're writing is just to make sure you're getting the point across, but you're writing for a whole variety of different people. And their expectations of language are going to be different. So what you want is something that's very neutral and very, I guess in a way, simple.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. The next question came from Rifan from MOF. The question is, do you think that the more reputable journal will require the higher quality English writing in order to be accepted? Do you have any specific strategies or suggestion in writing for a reputable journal?
Yeah, okay. I'll respond to that, and I'm sure Paul will have something to say about it after I do. A lot of people, when people ask that question, I think a lot of people are worried about the fact if there are, if I have mistakes, if I have grammatical mistakes or maybe vocabulary problems in my paper, it's going to be just automatically thrown out. And that, in the first instance, that's not the case. As Paul Kotorska was saying earlier, and there's a lot of research aside from what he was saying as well that absolutely backs him up on this, that editors will not throw out a piece of paper if there's an interesting idea and a very sound argument, even if there's problems with the vocabulary here and there, even if there's grammatical problems with the sentences here and there. As long as there's what we call surface level errors that can be fixed up easily, they're really not going to be too worried about those things. Because what they're really after is a really interesting idea that's been well argued. So you don't need to really worry about that quite so much as you want to. Of course, that said, you want the paper to be as grammatically correct and as as possible, and as lexically precise and concise as we were talking about earlier as possible. Of course you do. But if something slips through, it's actually not the end of the world, okay? Unless unless you're doing colorless green ideas sleep furiously, then you've got a real problem right there. I mean, if the paper doesn't if they're just chock full of mistakes that finally it doesn't make sense, it's a verbal salad, then then indeed you've got a problem there. But that's quite extreme. So, Paul, did you have anything?
No, I agree completely. Don't think that the higher the, I don't know how you define a journal, the higher the quality, but the journals that have higher impact factors, or however you want to measure this, it isn't the case that they're just going to be demanding better and better English. They may be more demanding in terms of the content, but I think that those two things have to be separated. You have to communicate the content, but as Paul says, a lot of these things, I mean, as a native speaker, I can go through a paper pretty quickly and clean up a lot of little grammatical errors because they just leap out at me. And so, I mean, some editors really are too busy to do that, but a lot of editors, let's just put it this way. There's an advantage that scholars from Indonesia and maybe from Southeast Asia generally have, because journals like diversity among their authors. And so if a good paper comes in from Indonesia, the editor is likely to say, well, okay, here's a good paper and I'm interested in this. It's got a few problems, but we would really like to get an Indonesian author into our journal. So maybe we'll work on this a bit. Not always, but this is also a possibility.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is from Ridwan Arifin from Universitas Negeri Semarang. There are two questions. The first one, concerning claims. Sometimes I faced many problems, especially on argumentative claims. How can we make sure that our claims is good or argumentative enough? Because there are claims for facts, values, or claims on policies.
Yeah.
First question.
Right. Well, whether you're talking about factual claims or whether you're talking about policy claims, some kind of evaluation that's going on, it doesn't make any difference. You have to have data that backs things up in the end, and you have to take that data and you basically turn it into reasons for why the claim is so, and then you have to be able to go into your data and you have to find some very specific examples that illustrate it, or you have statistics that will back things up, or you have expert testimony that will also back that up. I mean, in the end, that's really what it comes down to. So as long as the claim is backed up by its data, so you have reasons that you can take. So okay, I didn't mean to get into this, but I will. See, your claim has certain key ideas in it, right? And each one of those key ideas has to be explained, has to be described, and then its relationship with the other key ideas has to be explained. And the descriptions and the explanations have to be demonstratable by your data. And as long as you do that, you're fine. If you can't do that, you're in deep trouble. So that in the end, that's really what it comes down to. So yeah, that's and whether you evaluating policy or whether you're simply doing something else, it's all the same, really.
What I'd just add to that is that hardly anyone manages to have the last word on the subject.
Oh yeah.
So, academic work goes on in the form of discussion and argument and disagreement. So you make your claim, you support your claim. Don't expect that claim is just going to sit there without being challenged. because somebody's going to look at that and say, well, look, I've got evidence that says something different. And so they'll put forward a counterclaim. And this is the way academic work has progressed over the years, is that, and it's not necessarily that one's right and one's wrong. Maybe you have one set of evidence, that other one has a different set of evidence.
Yeah.
So why does that happen? I can give you a specific example. James C. Scott, who I'm sure a lot of you have read his work, and he wrote this book called The Moral Economy of the Peasant. And the idea there was how poor peasants, very close to the line where they're going to fail, how they behave. So he had this explained, and other people took this idea up and they say, oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to try it out in my field site. And then they would discover, no, it doesn't work there. And Scott's answer to that was, I didn't write about your field site. I wrote about certain places in Southeast Asia, and I would argue it does work there. And I'm glad that you found this interesting. I'm glad you took that question off to your site, and I'm sure that there's a benefit because you asked that question in your field site. But don't come back and say I'm wrong because it didn't work where you are. I never said it did.
Mr. Kratoska, you're in mute. Your microphone. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me try that again.
Do it all over again, Paul.
Yeah,
Right.
that was a long spiel too.
Yeah, it was. It was good, though. It was really good.
Yeah, you could see that it was good, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me start that over. I was trying to say that you're going to be, whatever claim you make, you defend it with certain pieces of information. And that doesn't mean that somebody else is not going to challenge it. So what the expectation is in academic work is that people discuss, they argue, and it doesn't necessarily mean that one is wrong and one is right. What's going to happen is that you've got your evidence and the other person has evidence, and maybe your evidence adds up to what you said. The other person's evidence adds up to what that person said. Well, neither of you have all the facts in the world. So you're just saying, okay, based on what I see, this is the way people behave. This is what happens when certain conditions are out there. And the other person said, well, yeah, well, based on what I've got, then this is what happens. Okay, so you put this material out, and then other people read this and they say, okay, that's an interesting idea. I'll take it off to my site and see what happens. Now, what will happen for sure is that you take this question, this approach out to your site, you'll learn something. You may learn something that supports or disagrees with what the claim that you're investigating is, but it'll be beneficial because you have a new angle, a new perspective on what you're doing. And I was giving the example, James Scott, whose book, The Moral Economy of the Peasant, I think quite a few of you probably know. And so this was a book that was talking about peasant behavior when people are very poor. It's sort of at the line where if things go wrong even a little bit, they suddenly are in a disastrous condition because they can't survive. So he wrote this book. A lot of people found his analysis really interesting, and they proceeded to take it off, and they looked at other places in other parts of the world. And what happens is they came back and they said, oh no, you're wrong, because I tried this in Latin America and Africa, and no, it doesn't work. And his answer to that was simply to say, well, I didn't write about your field site. I wrote about my field site, and in my field site, it works. I'm glad you found the question interesting. I hope you learned something by asking that question, and you probably did. But that's really as far as I was trying to go. So you make your claim, you support it. Unless you're just fantastically lucky, somebody's going to argue with you.
Okay. He still has one more question. The question is, It is very interesting when you explain concerning the clarity, how we make our paper clear enough. My problem is when I write my paper, mostly law paper, I sometimes use jargon or foreign phrase. When I translate into English, it has different meaning. How is your advice?
Wow. Well, that's always a problem, actually. But that when you're doing translation now, but if you okay, if you're doing law, um, it would seem to me, first of all, that you might just simply introduce the foreign word into your paper, frankly, and then just give a simple gloss as to what it means, rather than trying to rather than trying to explain it. I'm not quite sure I see the problem here, though.
Well, this problem of
Yeah.
translation,
Translation, yeah, generally.
but if you think about Asian studies in English,
Hmm.
I mean, papers written in English, every one of those papers, and this goes back as far as you want to go, is an act of translation, because they're describing events that took place basically in an Asian language. And so they're trying to explain using English what happened in the case of somebody who was actually speaking Malay or Chinese or Vietnamese at the time. And very often there's a problem because the term that for the situation you're describing, there may be an absolutely exact word in the Asian language, and there's no equivalent in English.
In English, yeah.
And one of the things that happens every time you learn a language, you're probably going to be taking a dictionary, which is a dual language dictionary. And you look in that dictionary and you have this word in one language and it tells you what the word is in the other language. And that can work perfectly well if you're talking about a chair or a table or a horse or a mouse or something like that. But then you get to something more complex, and it really doesn't. And so as a writer, you've got a problem here, and you've got two choices. You can use the Asian language word and explain to people that don't know that word just exactly how it works. Or you can translate that word into an English word that probably isn't quite exact, but maybe is close enough. And if you want an example of that, there's an awful lot of literature from the 19th century where people from, well, I'm talking about Malaya here, and they came out from the UK and they were trying to explain to people what's going on there. So you had a whole bunch of small states and relationships between people in charge and people underneath. And so they said, well, this kind of looks like European feudalism. So you have all sorts of terminology that's taken from European feudalism and is used to explain situations in Southeast Asia, like vassal states, tribute, and things like that. And it sort of works, but it's also very imprecise. But so you could use the exact word that was used in Malay or in Thai or whatever language it is, or you can play around with some analogous word in English. But this is the problem that's just involved in every single work that's done on Asian studies, with the possible exception of studies of colonialism where the documents are in English or French or Dutch.
So to our question asker, struggle on.
Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, but he's using I assume kind of technical terms.
I think it's very hard to respond to this without looking at specific words that are, being talked about.
Yeah.
Okay. I
No,
think
we'll
we
leave
can
it at that
move to
then.
the next. Yeah, we can move to the next question. It's from Betty Alia from Universitas Kristen Maranatha. She asked, should I put linking sentence in every paragraph, or can I mention a part of the previous paragraph for connection? Thank you.
Do both. Yeah, put linking sentences in every paragraph, and also basically, if you talking about ideas that were introduced in the previous paragraph, by all means note that as well. Yeah, that's yes, right on.
Okay.
Her instinct is correct to do that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The next question came from Antonia Rahayu Rosario Wibowo. The question is, you mentioned about using table or graph at almost the end of your presentation, Mr. Nerni, and she asked, do we need to explain the table or graph that we use?
Tricky question. Okay. If you have presented, because we see this actually in a lot of the papers that you guys did. So yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for it. If you have the table or the graph, and then you simply repeat the information. You simply repeat the information that's in the table or graph. That's really not going to do. That's not going to do very much at all. You used a key word here, explain. If you start to explain the relationships between the different items in the graph or the table, that's a good thing to do, I think. Because graphs and tables, they will describe or identify certain things. They may even indicate, if lines going up and lines going down and so forth, bars rising to a certain length and bars are rising to a lower length, whatever the case may be. Okay, you kind of see that, but that does have to be actually explained in terms of the context from which the data was taken. And yes, that's a very valuable thing to do, to explain it. Yes, you do need to explain it, but do not simply repeat the what you've got inside the table or the graph or the picture.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of having a table is to help people visualize something where if you put it into a paragraph, it would just be a whole running list of something that would be hard to track. So you make bullet points, you make a table, and then people can kind of pick it out point by point.
Yep.
Okay. Before we proceed, the time actually shows that we need to move on to the second session. Is it
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Okay, then. So we'll move on to the next question. It comes from Azam from University of Groningen, I think from the Netherlands. I'd like to ask you more about conciseness. I often find long sentences on many academic books, even journals, which I think can be made more concise. First, according to your experience, what kinds of requirements or conditions that allow us to create a long sentence without very much worry being unconcise? Second, how do you define whether one sentence is too long or not?
Right. Okay. First of all, brother, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of really long sentences that don't belong there. They could be shortened up. I hear you and I agree with you. Okay, so no problems there whatsoever. I'm going to give you kind of a kind of formula to think about in deciding the length of sentences. Okay, so you basically have your main clause. All right. You got your main clause. This is the main idea that you want to talk about. But again, there are certain key ideas in that clause that you want to elaborate more on. You want to explicate them a little bit more. So you add other clauses. So the way you do this is the main clause is at the top level. And then you may basically have a second level of clauses that go inside that main clause at different points. Okay, so you have a second level. You may even possibly have a third level. Now, that explains certain ideas within the second level, right? Okay, but once you get to a fourth level, a fifth level, a sixth level, you're losing your reader. Again, the research shows this, that cognitively speaking, people can process things at 3 different levels. And I'm simplifying this just a little bit, at three different levels fairly easily. But once you get beyond that, people can no longer do it. So that's what I say. You can basically have clauses in a single sentence at 3 different levels, and it will be comprehensible. Okay, it may even be rather long, but it'll be comprehensible. The other thing about this that you have to remember is you have to keep related information close together. So even if you have your main clause up here and it's punctuated by different clauses at different levels, that's okay. But always the information is closely related. You have to keep the clauses also closely related. You can't be talking about one thing. You can't mention one thing and then at the end of the clause talk about it again. It gets crazy, and people won't be able to follow what you're saying. Okay, that's a whole. By the way, that is a whole. That's probably a whole separate lecture all by itself. But that's the general principle of what I'm talking about. Yeah, and I think think about that just about 3 levels. Don't go beyond 3 levels, and keep all related information together.
I think the thing you have to bear in mind is that you're trying to communicate. And if a long sentence doesn't help with that, there's no reason to do it.
Don't do it.
Yeah. And often you look at a sentence, you think, what's the point? I mean, what's the value that's been added by making that sentence run on for such a long time? I've had sentences come in that I think I counted one that was 167 words in a paper, and I think it broke down to probably 5 or 6 sentences after you start taking it apart, because it was, first of all, you couldn't understand it very clearly, and if you went through it bit by bit and sort of take the clauses out and say, okay, what's going on here, you could turn it into something that people could understand. So just start with the point that you're trying to communicate and ask if your sentence does that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good suggestion. Okay. The next question came from Elvis from Unika Widya Mandira Kupang. For a research report in the methodology section, should we use simple present tense or past tense?
Well, like I was basically what I was saying before, that if you're making a claim and you have evidence that allows you to say that there are no exceptions to this claim whatsoever. There are no exceptions. There's no variation. This has always been true in the past. It's always true. It's true right now. It will continue to be true in the future. There's no chance that anything will ever change. You can use the simple present tense. On the other hand, if that is not the case, and that is usually the situation, then I think you need to think about modifying. You can use the simple present tense, but you've got to modify it in the ways that we were talking about it earlier. And so I think modification is what you probably as social scientists anyway, that's probably what we're stuck with, frankly. We need to moderate claims. Now, you don't want to over moderate the claim, as we were discussing earlier, but you want to make sure that you moderate it enough so that your evidence support will clearly support that thing, while at the same time allowing for variation, other claims to possibly exist. Okay.
Let me just toss something in, because I mean, I'm a historian, and so we run into this quite a lot. And how do you deal with things that happened in the past and so on? And one place that people get in trouble, somebody wrote a book in 1950, let's say. Now that book exists today. So you can talk about that book and you can say, this author said, past tense, in 1950. You can also say the book says, because the book is still around. And so that book, and so anybody can pick up that book today, and it's saying this right now. So you need to kind of think about the positioning in time that you're talking about, if that's making any sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and the other thing you have to think about too is that if you're using past tense and you're talking about a particular book or the ideas in that book, that what you're really saying is, in the past tense, that this was an idea that was true then and it was relevant to that time, but it may not be so. It may still be true, but it may not be so relevant to what I'm talking about now, and it may even be less relevant in the future. That, in effect, is what you're saying with past tense. So, and if that's what you mean, then that's fine. But on the other hand, especially when you're writing a research article, somebody is probably going to say, especially editors are going to say, well, if this is really actually not so relevant to what you're doing, why is it even here in the first place? Why aren't you dealing with something that's much, much more current? And in that case, if we're talking about current research, and this person says that, then that's indicating currency that's right now. It was probably true in the past, and as far as we know, it'll be true in the future. We don't know for sure, but it could very well be. So I mean, that's the other difference that goes on here about the relevancy, your attitude about the relevancy of of these ideas and this person's research to what you're doing.
Okay, the next question came from Anton Abdul Fattah from Belgium. The question is, how far can we utilize phrases or idioms in scientific writing? Thank you.
Well, utilize away, I think. I mean, well, I don't know. For me, anyway, a phrase is a part of a sentence. Usually, it's an idea group within a sentence, and so I'm not quite sure what you're talking about with phrase exactly here, or you mean idiomatic? But if you mean like idiomatic language, in other words, and I would take that to mean informal language, maybe.
That's the kind of thing that came up a few questions ago.
Yeah. So,
well, let me just toss one thing into that.
yeah.
Writing styles change. And if you look at the way people wrote 50 years ago and 100 years ago, what was good writing then is not such good writing now. And just to give you one very simple example, there's an awful lot of work where people are talking about we. Now they mean one person, me, the writer, but they were discouraged from saying I. So they say, we studied this, we came up with this conclusion. Yeah. And what they mean is, I studied this, I came up with this conclusion. Or another alternative is you don't put yourself in there at all. Everything is just third person, very neutral. And today, the standard of that is changing, and people are actually encouraged to put themselves in to a limited extent. And where you put yourself in is where you have shaped the idea. This is your creation. So what's the point of pretending it's not? So you can say, so I did the survey. I went to the archive or whatever it might be. You don't have to put yourself in all the time. But that kind of thing years ago would really have not gone down well at all. So, standards change. And I guess about the formality of the language. If you look at 19th century scholarship, it was written by people who'd been trained in Latin and Greek. And so they had all these ways of writing that reflected what they had learned in studying those languages. That's gone.
The person who asked gave an example in the question and answer session. He said idioms such as a white elephant.
Oh,
That if that's me.
nah. No, I would, I would, generally speaking, I would avoid that. And it kind of goes back to, when I was nattering on last night about, the people use metaphors to talk about internalized, internalized strategies for writing and stuff. Well, this is the same thing. When you say a white elephant, I mean, you're not really referring to a white elephant. Obviously, you're referring to something else, something that's useless. So why not just identify the useless thing and leave it at that? I mean, there has been a whole movement. It's called the plain English movement since the 1970s, which, and again, this is something Paul was just talking about earlier, but the 70s was kind of a tsunami that kind of washed over the academe, as well as business also, and just said, do away with all these things. So that's where we happen to be at this point. The white elephants may come back sometime in the future. I don't know. You never know about these things, but yeah, the use of metaphor, the use of metaphor, unless the metaphor is really particularly clever and is really bringing out some kind of point you want to bring out, I
And
would
don't give them a way out here. You were doing fine. They don't need
Yeah.
to use these things.
Yeah, don't use it. No. That's it. Okay. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Yes.
Unless,
Okay,
of course, you're talking about Siam in the 19th century when there were real white elephants, and those were significant. You can talk
Oh,
about
well,
them.
yeah, of course. That's right. You can still talk about them.
Okay, so I'll make this the last question for this session. It came from Tegar Satya, Universitas Atmajaya, Yogyakarta. The question is, what do you think about inserting catchy words on the title of the manuscript?
Any examples?
He didn't give an example, apparently.
Paul and I like catchy words as long as they're really catchy. Yeah, we have long conversations about this, about titling and everything. And so, there's, yeah, but if you're not quite sure about what you're doing, don't do it. Just keep the title neutral. Make sure that you've identified the topic. Make sure you've identified your perspective on the topic. I mean, in terms of the question and answer, you're trying to capture those things, and just kind of leave it at that. But there are some very, very clever titles. Paul, if you remember, you have the story. I'm trying to remember the story you told me about. It was like a 3-word title or something that.
Well, the 4-word titles, yes.
A 4-word title, yeah. That's a good
Well,
example of this.
Well, okay, but first of all, let me say authors are terrible. I mean, really terrible at creating titles. And I would say probably 60 or 70% of the titles that I've had come in over the years, books and articles, have had to be changed because they're too wordy. They don't communicate anything. Somebody's got this. I just threw one out. There was a quote from somebody that was mentioned in the article, but you looked at that quote, it didn't tell you anything about what was in the article. So seriously, it was useless. The title that Paul Nerdy's talking about, there were 2 of them. And so one of them, there was a book that deals with northern Thailand and also the areas outside of Thailand where there's a Thai population. And so we were fiddling around with this, trying to think, what can we do that will capture this, what the book is about? Because what it was looking at was this Thai population, some of them inside the country and some of them living in South China, living in the Shan states in Burma, living in Laos. And what we came up with, when you're talking about Thailand, the Thai people outside, usually it's written as T apostrophe AI. In Thailand, you have THAI. The H is an aspirated T, so it's the same thing, Thai, but it's spelled differently. And so we came up with the title of Thai, T-A-I, Lands and Thailand, because that captured the fact that we're talking about the lands occupied by Thai people outside of Thailand, plus their relationship with the country, Thailand. It took a lot of back and forth to get to that. And one of the best things you can do in working on a title is to talk to somebody back and forth, and try to cut it down, try to trim it.
Okay. All right, I think we'll close the first session and we're going to move on to the next session, our second session today with Dr. Paul Kratoska discussing publishing ethics. Dr. Kratoska, the floor is yours. Thank you for Paul Nerney for the
You're
fruitful
welcome.
session.
And Paul Kratoska, thank you for that 20 minutes, extra 20 minutes you gave me. I hope that's all right, brother. I hope it's all right. I hope I don't know you. Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
well, the first thing I've got to do is get this to work, and boy, we'll see if come on, start up slideshow from beginning. Okay, are you seeing anything or not?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so that didn't work this time again. Okay, let me try it again. Let's move that over there. See if I can make it work now. I've got 3 screens and I still can't. I've got screen 1, and this is supposed to happen on screen 1. And somehow it doesn't want to do it. So let me bring this down. I'm moving these around between screens. So let's see now. What are you seeing? Anything?
Not yet. Still nothing. Only you. Okay. Now it's
Okay.
working.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to talk about is scholarly ethics. And if you wait till the end of this, I will give you a slide that will really make you frightened. It will maybe make you cry. It will make you despair. So that's something to look forward to, or maybe not.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Kratoska.
Yep.
You haven't put it in the slideshow mode?
I have not. You're right.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So first of all, academic research really relies on the integrity of scholars. And there are several things to say about that. First of all, as a publisher, I cannot identify a lot of things that might make research unethical. I just don't have the time, I don't have the tools. So in one way, any publisher, any journal editor is relying on the author to be ethical in what they do. And we'll talk about what that amounts to as we go along here. Now, once in a while, when you send an article out for peer review, the reviewer will identify an issue and say, there's something wrong here, that something about the way this has been done. The person has not respected scholarly ethics. Readers might or might not pick up something. So there are all these problems. And then this question about the integrity of the scholar. When you are writing an article, you are undoubtedly drawing on a lot of information. You've done research, you've collected a lot of data. What you're going to put in the article is only a small sampling of that. Now, we're relying on you to be fair, to be honest in your interpretation of your data. And so maybe you have a certain amount of information that says one thing, but you have some piece of information that suggests that might be wrong. So what do you do about it? Do you hide it? Or do you say, well, okay, I think this is what happened and this is why, but at the same time, there is this other piece of information, just be upfront about it. So this is all built into this question of trust. But trust is really fundamental in the academic world. And for that reason, if it looks like you're not trustworthy, if there's an ethical lapse of some kind, the response can be very harsh. Now, if you want to look up some information about this, there's something called the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE. And if you do an online search for that, you can find their code of conduct. But on top of that, if you think about what is going on with the social sciences especially, researchers are dealing with real human beings, and you have a lot of responsibility in the way you treat the information you get, because you may well find out things that are embarrassing. You might find out information that's potentially harmful to the people that gave it to you. So what do you do with that? And the answer is that in sociology and anthropology, there are codes of ethics, and the first principle in both cases: do not do any harm to the people who you've interviewed, the people who you've studied. So you need to be careful with this sort of thing. When it comes to publishing, or writing and publishing, if I'm talking about ethics, the word that comes to mind is plagiarism. And when people think about plagiarism, very often what they're talking about or thinking about is using somebody else's words, stealing somebody else's language. And that certainly is one meaning of it, that using someone else's words as your own is plagiarism. Now, we go after students all the time for this. And it's really shocking that people who will criticize a student for copying some passage and not indicating that it was copied will turn around and they'll do the same thing in some of their own work, but it does happen. So just to go over the ground again, if you're quoting somebody, if you're taking the words that somebody else has written, you have two choices. You can make it in a block quote, and that's if it's a long passage, if they're, say, 5 or 6 lines at least. You indent the whole thing, and that indicates that it's a quote. If you've done that, if you've indented it, you do not need to put quotation marks or inverted commas. Alternatively, you can just put the quotation marks around the passage in the text. So secondly, you identify the source. In other words, you have a footnote that tells people, I got this in this passage, not just the information, but I got the passage, the words, from this particular source. And here's the page number. And if you go to that page number and check up on me, that's where it is. And there are limits to the acceptable number of words, but if you're doing something on a not-for-profit basis, as most scholarship is, you don't have to worry too much unless you're taking page after page after page, unless it's a literary work. And I don't think most of you are quoting from works of literature, so we won't go on about that, but mostly just do something reasonable. But all that said, editors like it when people put things in their own words. So one of the things that happens when you're a student is that you look at somebody's writing, you say, well, I can't possibly write that well, so I will just quote. But as a professional, your job really is to communicate in your own words much more than it is to use other people's words. Okay, so fair use is a doctrine that says for nonprofit, educational, and non-commercial uses, you can take a certain number of words, a certain passages, and you can use them so long as you identify the author and the source. So when do you not need to give a citation for information? Well, anything that's common knowledge, you don't have to give a citation. What it's required for is information or interpretations that are not common knowledge, something that's a unique contribution, something that you discovered or that somebody else discovered and you're using that piece of information. But it's going to be news. It's going to be something that most people reading your article are unfamiliar with. And at that point, that's where you put a citation. And if you're in doubt about something, it's better to cite it than not. Okay, so next, do scholars own their own work? Well, fundamentally, if you wrote it, you own it. And the way copyright law works. If I write a grocery list, buy milk, buy fish, whatever it might be, that's my work and I own it. And it is actually under copyright, generally copyright law. So if somebody were to take that and use it, they would be violating my rights. Now, that's a silly example and nobody's really going to worry about a grocery list. But fundamentally, anything that you write, you own. First point, unless, and there are several unlesses here. If you do something that's called work for hire, you don't own it. And the way that works is, let's say you're a research assistant and some professor is paying you to go and gather information. Now, because you're being paid for that, you cannot claim that you own that information. That information belongs to the person who paid for it. So that's work for hire. Second thing that happens is when you publish something, you give up some of your rights to the material that you wrote. So normally what will happen with a publication contract or with an agreement for a journal article is that the publisher may ask for copyright. In other words, you transfer your copyright to the publisher, or the publisher may ask for the exclusive right to publish the material. So that's a limitation on your rights with regard to the material that you've written. Now, where do we get into trouble with this? Well, you wrote something, and so you feel like, okay, it's my material. And you go out and you publish it. Now, what happens if you think, well, okay, that worked pretty well. I'll just do that again. I'll publish the same material or part of it a second time. I won't bother to tell anybody, but it was interesting material. Well, that's double dipping. And it's not going to do your career any good at all if you're seen to be publishing the same material more than once. Now, people do get by with variations on that. And I remember talking to somebody about a fairly well-known writer. And she said, well, I always read his books. But it's pretty easy because every book is pretty much the same. I mean, he wasn't double dipping exactly, but he would write a different book, but many of the ideas in each book were somewhat similar. Then another unethical thing that people do is taking parts of a previous publication and using that again. Now, this is small parts, but they use it again without admitting that it came from a previous publication. And again, that's unethical, and it's known as self-plagiarism. So try not to do that. So what can you do with the material that you've written? Well, first of all, when you start off writing something, you have a preliminary draft. And so in the past, what people would do is to write a draft of an article, and then they would send it around to a bunch of people and ask for comments. And so 10 or 15 other people would write back and they'd say, okay, well, I think you've got a little problem at this point. Maybe you should check a certain book or whatever it might be. And that was perfectly acceptable. And so these days there are more efficient ways to do that. And one way is something that's called a preprint. And there are preprint servers around where people are taking their preliminary drafts, They're putting it online on a preprint server. People also just put something up on a personal web page, or they put it into a university repository. And then they can contact a bunch of people that might be interested, and they can say, okay, I've got this paper, it's on my web page, or it's in the university repository. Could you take a look at it and then send me some comments? So the paper has been read by various people, and is that a problem for publication? And the answer is no, that if you've done that, that's not going to be a problem at all when it comes to getting your work published. However, what happens as you move along is that you finalize your article, and you probably have somebody who does some copy editing on it. And by copy editing, we mean somebody who goes through the final copy, fixes up the grammar, maybe looks at sentences that don't seem to work very well. And some of this is going to be done by a publisher, by a journal editor. And so once that's been done, you have a somewhat different situation. And a lot of publishers and a lot of journal editors will say, all right, the early drafts, that's fine. You can circulate those and that's not a problem. But once we have invested time and effort in finalizing this manuscript, we would prefer that it's going to go in the journal, and we want people to read it in the journal. Because if they have the final version, why would they bother to go and buy the journal, or why would they download it in their university library? Then you have one last version of your paper, and that is the published version. So the final manuscript is still a manuscript. It's going to be probably on A4 paper. It'll have its own set of page numbers. But if somebody wanted to quote that, that wouldn't be much good, because it's the published version that's going to count. It's the published version that people are going to be able to quote. And publishers usually do not allow authors to put that published version. What I mean by that is the version the publisher has put into the journal. It's called the version of record. And most publishers will say that is our property. You cannot put that online. So at this point, you have a distinction. You have your ideas and your words, and that's the final manuscript. But the version of record is, you can think of it as an object. It's an object created by the publisher, and the publisher has rights over that object. Now, if you want to know the policies of different academic journals concerning this, there is this database called Sherpa Romeo, and you can just look that up online, and it will explain to you for particular journals what their policy is about copyright, about open access, about archiving and self-archiving pieces of work that are published. Okay, so I've been talking about copyright, and copyright is simply the right to copy. It's exclusive legal rights over intellectual property. And as I said earlier, it's automatically created when you write something, when you create a work. Now, it's something that can be transferred, it can be assigned. In other words, you have, again, it's kind of an object or a commodity. And you can then transfer that to a publisher, or you can assign it to a publisher. And it has some monetary value in certain cases. How long does copyright last? Well, this differs from country to country. But in the US and the United Kingdom and also Indonesia, it currently lasts for 70 years after the death of the author. So that means that everything that you write for the lifetime of your children, mostly, will belong to them. There is another type of copyright, though, and that's just the Creative Commons copyright. Now, Creative Commons copyrights are created for open access publications. And open access, the idea is that you want to get everything out there. You don't want it restricted the way it would be restricted by copyright. So as open access took off, and as I said earlier, it started off around the turn of the century, so it's not very old. This is just over 20 years. But the question of how do you copyright, how do you protect the rights of somebody if the material is going to be out there freely available to everybody? And the solution to that was proposed is Creative Commons copyrights, and there are several different variations on this. So the freest one is this CC-BY. And what it says is that other people can, with regard to your work, they can distribute it, they can remix it, they can tweak it, they can build upon it. They can sell it. I mean, you've given it for free. It's out there as open access. But if somebody else finds a way to make money off it, they're welcome to do it, so long as they attribute it to you. And that's what the BY here is all about. This is, generally speaking, not a very good type of Creative Commons copyright for humanities and social sciences. And the reason is very simple. It's got to do with what the author contributes. So in the sciences, you've got data, and the whole idea of this is kind of built on what happens in the sciences. So you have done experiments, so you've found some scientific information, and the way science works is that people build on this sort of information, and so keeping it behind a paywall, holding it back, really doesn't help the advance of science at all. Well, in the case of what I do, and again, I'm a historian, so I go to archives and I collect notes, photocopies, what have you, from the archive. Anybody can do that. So there's nothing particularly special about the fact that I've been in an archive, except that I did it and nobody else did. But anybody who wanted to could go and get the same material. So my contribution to this is not the information that I put out. It's my analysis and interpretation of that information. And I do not, and so if it was put out under this CC-BY copyright, somebody else could take my analysis, my interpretation, and they could remix it, they could tweak it, they could build upon it. And then because my name would be on it, people would think that is what I said. And I don't want that, because frequently they would be saying something that I wouldn't want to say. So there are more restrictive Creative Commons copyrights, and the most restrictive is the one that I've listed here. And what this is: attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives. And so if I were to use this kind of copyright, other people could download my work, and that's free. They could share them with other people, so long as they credit it to me. But they could not, they're not allowed to change them in any way, and they cannot use them commercially. And I think a lot of people in the social sciences and humanities, if they do put work out as open access, they prefer to use the restrictive Creative Commons copyright because it protects their ideas in ways that the more open ones don't. So let's talk about some unethical practices. So one of them is data fabrication. In other words, people who make up data. Now, of course, none of us would do that, but somewhere in the academic world, there are people that do. And it's definitely an unethical thing to do. Sometimes, and again, none of us would do this, but sometimes an author sends an article in, and figures out who the peer reviewer is. So the author will contact the peer reviewer and try to influence the decision by having a word with the person doing the review. Definitely not something you should do. I've talked about self-plagiarism. And then there's what people call salami publishing. Now, this is a word that makes a lot of sense to people who've been around delicatessens in the West. I'm not entirely sure how much sense it makes in an Indonesian context, but salami, of course, is a sausage. And if you go to a delicatessen, you can have it cut into extremely thin slices, so thin that you pick it up and you can almost see through it. And salami publishing is where somebody takes the information they have, and they could probably write one pretty good article. But what they do instead is they take a tiny little bit of that data and they write an article about that. And then they take another tiny little bit and they write an article about that. And so the content of each of these articles is really not very much, just like that slice of salami doesn't have much content to it. And when editors see that, they really don't like it very well, because an editor is going to use up space in the journal for every article that gets published. Every article that gets published is denying somebody else an opportunity to publish. So if somebody's playing this game and saying, okay, I probably have material here for one good article, but I'm going to turn it into 5 small articles, this is likely to get you rejected. Now, here's something else, of course, none of us would ever do, but once in a while, apparently, somebody wants to get published, so they write to an editor, and they say, well, I've got this article. I'd like to know if you'd like to publish it, and by the way, I have $100 I could pass your way. If you get caught doing that, you're finished. Sometimes there's a conflict of interest involved in an article. Maybe somebody is doing business, writing about business, and has written about one particular company and written about it in a very positive way, but doesn't bother to tell anybody that the author also owns stock, owns shares in that company. Well, that would be a conflict of interest, and that would be unethical. Okay, now everybody is looking for citations. And this is an unethical practice on the part of an editor or on the part of the peer reviewers. And so a peer reviewer gets hold of an article, and the peer review has been selected because the reviewer works in that field, and discovers that the reviewer discovers that his or her own work has not been cited. Now, it may make sense to include their work, and in some cases it probably does, but it's a very tricky situation, because if you ask the author to cite your work, what you're doing is asking the author to do something that will benefit you, because you will get an additional citation out of that. Once in a while, somebody will submit an article and it will be accepted for publication. Now, what you have to remember is that when an article is accepted, it means it's gone through the peer review process, and the journal you submitted it to has probably done editorial work on it. So they have invested time and effort in your article. And they probably sent back this article to you with corrections. And so it's a better article than you submitted it. One of the worst things you could do at that point then is to say, well, I think I found someplace else that would actually be more prestigious, so I'm going to take back the article and send it there. Occasionally, somebody will just outright steal an article. And the places that people get by with this, once in a while, a supervisor will be working with a student, and the student writes something, and the supervisor will take it and publish it under his or her own name. But there are other instances. Somebody gets hold of an article and says, "Well, that's pretty good. I'll send it off and claim it's mine." And then there are dual submissions. People often ask, "Well, is it all right to send an article to 2 journals at the same time?" And the answer to that is definitely no. And for the simple reason that when an article is being processed, the publisher is investing time and effort in that. And they're asking the reviewers to spend their time on that. And what's likely to happen if you do this, if you submit it to 2 journals, it could well be that both editors will pick the same referee. And so if I write to a referee and the referee says, "Well, that's really odd because I just got invited to look at that article by another journal." So at that point, what's likely to happen is that I will get in touch with the editor of the other journal and say, "This person has submitted it to both journals at the same time, and we will both reject it." Okay, people also ask about social media services, and particularly Academia EDU and ResearchGate. What you need to understand about these, in both of them, is that they are commercial operations. People think, "Oh yeah, this is really nice. You can put your publications out and a lot of people will look at it." And it is convenient. But when you place material on those sites, you are almost certainly violating the rights of the publisher. So unless a journal is open access, and if it is open access, there's not much point in putting the article on Academia EDU or ResearchGate. You owe an obligation to your publisher, and if the publisher has got the copyright, you're violating copyright. If the publisher has said, "We want exclusive rights to publish this," you've violated that. Now, there's another problem. This has not come up yet, but it's worth paying attention to this. If you sign up for Academia EDU or for ResearchGate, they will ask you to sign an agreement before they let you onto the platform. And these agreements, I've gone through the Academia EDU fairly carefully. And these, I think it was about 4 pages long, and it's small print. And it's the kind of thing that people say, "Well, you know, I'm not going to bother. A lot of people are doing this. I'll just sign up." But what these agreements say is that when you upload material, you are telling Academia EDU that you have the right to do that. And if somebody takes legal action, if a publisher takes legal action against Academia EDU, and Academia EDU is found guilty of violating copyright and they have to pay something, they will come to you. And because you've signed an agreement with them, and they will just pass the legal claim on to you because you lied to them when you said you had the right to upload your article. So be very careful with these things. Now, there are other social media services, not nearly as popular as those 2. There's something called the Open Air Consortium, Zenodo. There's something called the Humanities Commons, and I suspect in future there'll be more of these alternative sites, which will offer ways that you can upload articles. But even then, you really have to be careful about, not violating the rights of your publisher, because you're going to want to go back to your publisher, to the journal editor again and say, "Well, I've got another article now, would you publish it?" And if they feel that you're doing funny things with the first publication, they may not want to hear from you again. Okay, then there's something that is really, really bad in terms of dishonesty, and that's something called Sci-Hub. Now, Sci-Hub is located in Kazakhstan, and that's one reason that they get by with this, because it's outside the reach of the courts in the West. But what they do is they download just about everything in sight, research papers and books. They do this in a variety of ways, but when they're doing it, they are compromising network security. They are jeopardizing lawful access to papers by university staff. They're violating copyright. In a way, they're threatening the viability of publishers. So nobody's going to stop you from going there, but I certainly would recommend against it. And now we come to the really scary part, and that's predatory journals. Now, predatory journals exist because of open access. Open access started up as something that was going to revolutionize academic publishing, and in a way it has. But as I said when I mentioned this in an earlier talk, there are still costs, and somebody has to pay the costs of covering, to get material out through open access. And these costs are often done in the form of article processing charges. So what's happened now is that there are journals that are created, they're not really genuine scholarly journals. They've been created simply for the purpose of collecting article processing charges. And what they'll do is they'll write to you and they'll say, oh, I see that you went to this conference and you had this paper. Would you like to publish your paper? We can bring it out really quickly. We'll have it out within a week. And by the way, if you have any other material, do you have a PhD dissertation or do you have some other articles? Because we could publish them right away too, very quickly. If you look at them, they sort of look like they're real scholarly journals. The titles sound legitimate. They'll say that they're included in prestigious indexes in Scopus or something like that. They'll claim they have very high impact factors. In fact, they mostly don't do any peer review at all. And they will publish your article in some way online if you pay the article processing charge. Now, what's dangerous about this is that when you submit the article, again, there's going to be a legal document. And this legal document is small print and a lot of it. But it turns out that that document is a contract. And by doing business with them, the contract is enforceable. And this contract may have somewhere in there a clause that says you have to pay them $1,000. And so if you start working with them, the contract requires that you pay that $1,000. You may not even have seen that. But they will chase after you then. They'll say, well, where's our $1,000? You signed this agreement. Now, there are lots of clues to what is a predatory journal. One of them is, do you know anything about the editorial board or the physical location? Now, the editorial boards often have people that nobody's ever heard of. And in one case, I was looking at how the thing was set up. And so there was a charge, but it did say if you're from a developing country, the charge can be reduced. What it actually said about that was the managing editor of the journal can reduce the charge. So I started looking to find out who the managing editor of that journal was. And I went through several pages on the screen, trying to find out who was on the editorial board. And finally, about the 7th or the 8th page, there was the editorial board. And there was a title, Managing Editor. And beside it, it said vacant. So there was no managing editor. And then we come to the physical location. And somebody asked me about a journal one time, and I looked that one up. And this one had a really nice location. It was on Park Avenue in New York City. It seemed like a kind of an odd place for a journal to be located. But I had the address, so I did a Google search on that address. And what did I discover? Well, that address, it was on Park Avenue. And what did you find at that address? You found a shop that did photocopying and rented out mailboxes. So what this journal had done was to rent a mailbox at a very prestigious address. And I guess somebody must have got around there occasionally and taken out whatever was in the mailbox and sent it on to wherever the journal was really located. So the warning signs for a predatory journal. If they're asking for a submission fee, that is, you have to pay them right away rather than a publication fee. So you're paying for the right to submit something. That's often a warning sign. Now, there are some prestigious journals in the sciences that do ask for some submission fees. So this is not an absolute thing. Secondly, you look at who's on the editorial board. And if you don't know the names, try looking them up. And one thing you're looking for is to find out whether if you find a web page for that person, does that person list this journal as one of the things they do? Because some of these journals just take the names of people, put them on the editorial board without bothering to tell them. If a whole bunch of new journals comes into existence, say a publisher comes along and says, oh, I'm starting up some new journals, please send me papers. There was one publisher a few years ago that started up 99 new journals all at one time. Look at the website and try to figure out if the English on that website is any good, because frequently it's not, or if there are a lot of ads on the website. These are all warning signs. Or if you have a sample of the journal, look at the contents and see if it matches the title, if it matches the scope of the journal. So there are lots of different ways to check this, but what you really want to do is to stay away from them. And so here's some suggestions. There's something called the Directory of Open Access Publications, or Directory of Open Access Journals in this case, the OAJ. So you can look there and see if the journal that you're looking at is listed. The problem with that is that I have a list somewhere of about 500 journals that claim they are in the Directory of Open Access Publications, but they're not. So you don't trust what the journal says. You have to go to the directory itself. Then one of the best things to do, there's a website you can go to, which is run by something called thinkchecksubmit.org. So the website's here, just that. And they have a whole list of pieces of advice for ways you can check to find out whether a journal is a legitimate journal or not. Then there's something called Beale's List of Potential Predatory Journals and Publishers. And here's the website for that. And you go to that. I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. And then there's something called Cable's Scholarly Analytics. And this is a very good site, but the problem is that it's not free. It's only by subscription. So if your library has subscribed to it, then you can get access to it, otherwise not. But they are listing, they have a black list, which is the journals that look bad, and a white list, which is the reputable journals. So if you go to thinkchecksubmit.org, there's a series here of questions. So one of them is, do you know the journal, or do your colleagues know anything about this journal? Can you identify the publisher, and can you find a contact information for that publisher? Is the journal clear about peer review? Are articles indexed in the indexing services you use? So are they in Scopus, for example? Is it clear what kind of fees they'll be charging? You check the website of the editorial board members. Do they mention this journal? You can look, well, we'll skip over that one, but you find out if they belong to the Committee on Publication Ethics. Again, this is all online. Is it in the Directory of Open Access Journals? And does the publisher belong to the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association? Okay, now we come to the scary bits. How many predatory journals are there? Well, I mentioned Cable's list of predatory journals. Their blacklist of predatory journals has more than 12,000 titles on it. Beale's list, which I also mentioned just a minute ago, has a list of standalone journals. Now, these are journals that are not part of a group. They're just individual publications. And that list has identified 1,500 journals that are predatory journals. In addition to that, they have identified more than 1,300 predatory publishers. Now, a publisher may have more than one journal, and a lot of them do. So some of those publishers list only maybe 10 or 20 journals. There's something on that list called academic and scientific publishing. Sounds fine, doesn't it? Academic and scientific publishing. They publish 400 journals. There's something called Asian and American Research Publishing Group. They have 450 journals. All of this is on the list of predatory publishers. And the chances are pretty good if you send an article off to any of these publications, you will regret it because it's basically just throwing your research away. So this is the frightening thing. There's a lot of bad publishing, bad publishers and bad journals around. And that is what I have to tell you today. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kratoska, for your presentations. We have some questions that are for you and regarding your presentation. The first one came from Tias from Universitas Terbuka. The question is, what about the ethical approval application as an independent researcher? Usually, it's hard for us as independent researchers in Indonesia since we do not have some kind of BERA or British Educational Research Association, for example.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what the question is, though. Say it again.
What about the ethical approval application as an independent researcher?
Ethical approval application. There is no ethical approval application. If you're doing research in a particular discipline, if you're an anthropologist or you're a sociologist, what I would do is do a Google search on anthropology ethics. And there are several things that will come up that will explain some basic points, but fundamentally it starts off with the idea that you're working with real people. And if you identify them by name, if you say something about what they have done or what they believe, you must get their permission in order to do that. Otherwise, you have to make it anonymous. So you can say, okay, I was doing research in this village, and you give a false name. And I was talking to a farmer, and the farmer said this. So you can make it anonymous and you could use this material. But if you identify the person, then you have to get approval from that person. So there are lots of, not lots, but there's several basic principles like that. So you observe the standards of the discipline you're in. But beyond that, there's nobody you apply to for this.
Okay. All right. The next question came from Nurdiana from Universitas Bunda Mulia Jakarta. The first question is the best one of plagiarism checker is turn it in to some people, but I see this application does not really reveal the truth. Like it detects common phrases and it says that they are plagiarized. What application would you recommend for plagiarism checker?
I don't really have a recommendation for that because there are a lot out there, and also the sort of grammar checkers and things like that. And I think, well, first of all, these are commercial operations. And even if I had a recommendation, I probably shouldn't do it because that would be supporting one commercial operation over another. What I would suggest, though, is that you just, again, go to do a Google search. Take whichever one you want to examine and just say the name of that and then put reviews and find out what user reviews are saying about it. Paul, do you have anything to say about plagiarism
Anything to add,
checkers?
Mr. Nani?
I
You're still on mute.
Yeah, I'm off now. Well, we did talk before you came on about grammar checkers. So I was, I mentioned them. Like you, I didn't mention. Well, we were talking about Grammarly, so said should I use Grammarly? Say yeah, you can use it, etc., etc. But you still have to check things for yourself in the end. I mean, also I think the other part of the question was they wanted to know if you could check to see whether you have plagiarized or not, right? Whether you used and stuff. And I do know that these are used by these are used by universities and by people who have term papers, and they want to check, especially with undergraduates, they want to check if the undergraduates have stolen other people's papers. You were talking about stealing a while ago. Well, this happens among undergraduates also. They just take somebody else's paper, oftentimes without the person's permission or knowledge, and they use it. And so these things can be caught. But normally, I mean, normally I would say, you don't need to do this with your own work. I mean, you'll know whether you plagiarized or not. It's I don't think you actually have to use these things to check plagiarism. I mean, plagiarism is quite well defined. I mean, as we saw in this. So yeah, you know when you're doing it. So don't do it.
Yeah, the dangerous thing that happens sometimes. I've found passages and I think, okay, I want to say something about that in a paper. So what I'll do is copy that passage and put it in my paper with the idea that, okay, it's there, then I'll go back to it.
Yeah.
And I'll write my own paragraph, but I want that material right there where I can see it. And once in a while, I think people have just lost sight of the fact that, I actually brought that in from somewhere else. And they get in trouble that way.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The next question from the same person. How should we quote sentences if they are strategies or procedures whose meaning might be different if we paraphrase them? Sorry. For example, like there are 5 steps to make good test. 1, determine the test specification. 2, make sure the test items are valid, etc. If this is what the authors write and it seems difficult to paraphrase, how should we quote them to avoid plagiarism? I hope you can.
Well, I think the example, it's sort of generic questions, and I don't think you'd have to worry about that. But if there's something about what you're borrowing from somebody, some special feature of the questions, then you just say you give the source that you got it from.
Yeah,
you can say, that this person or this book suggests following this procedure when you're doing something, these 5 points, and then you put a footnote to that, and you're all set. But if you do that, then you have to use the exact words because you're saying, okay, I'm using their words now. So, but with that example, you can easily reword those things. But the 2 you read, I think, wouldn't even need to be any rewording, just because anybody could come up with those words.
Okay. Move on to the next question. It came from Muzain, Universitas Islam Indonesia. I have an abstract for a conference uploaded by its organizer and available online. The complete paper with the same abstract is still under review for a journal. Is it unethical, or is it unethical presenting a work in a conference and sending the same work for a journal?
Probably not,
No,
unless
no.
the conference is in some way saying that that everybody who's coming to the conference has to contribute a paper to a proceeding or something like that. That would be risky. But no, people very often you present a paper at several conferences as you're perfecting it. The whole point of going to the conference is that you put out your ideas, and then people give you feedback. And I don't know of any conference that's going to let you read the whole paper anyway.
Okay. All right. Move on to the next question. I think this could be the last question. Came from Vida, Universitas Sriwijaya. I submitted my article to a journal. However, it's been a year and I have not received any news from the editor. I've sent them emails but got no replies. Do you think it is okay for me to submit that article to another journal?
You know, it's funny. I think this question has come up just about every workshop.
I know. Yeah.
There's some really bad editors out there.
I know. Good
Bad editors, yes. Okay, a year and a half is much too long. And if you're not getting any responses, then it's time to move on. It was time to move on about 8 months earlier. But do not move on without sending a letter to the journal where you submitted it saying, I hereby withdraw my article. The fact that you've written to this journal and they haven't responded probably comes close to doing what you need to do, but you want to do one more, and that is that you say, because you can explain why. You say, I haven't heard from you in so many months, and I want to withdraw my article, and so I can do something else with it. So let's back this up and say, well, how long should you wait? And you submit an article, and you have to reckon that it will take a journal probably at least a month to give it a preliminary reading and then decide, yes, we're going to proceed with this, and then identify referees and send it out. Now, journals will differ in how long they give a referee, but it probably would be at least a month, and some journals might say 2 months. So that's 3 months already where you really need to wait that long. A lot of journals will tell you, though, they'll say, okay, our standard practice is that we'll respond within this period of time. And you could really expect that, but if they don't, I wouldn't worry about it until after the 3 months. If it's a journal that has an automated submission system, you should be able to check there on the status of your manuscript. Okay, so then the 3 months passes, and that's where things get a little bit tricky, because the problem for a journal editor is that we have no control, we have no leverage over the referees. We're not paying them anything. They're doing it out of goodwill. And if they've accepted the paper and say, yes, I will referee it, it tells you, yes, they're interested. Most people they won't do this unless they really intend to referee the piece. But then they get busy. And so you write them and you remind them, and they write back, oh, yeah, I'll get to that. I meant to. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So but I would say after maybe another month, the editor really should be deciding, okay, that report is not going to come in, I'll go to somebody else. And ideally, the editor would write to the author at that point and say, okay, well, I'm sorry, there's a delay, that we had a referee that didn't respond, so we'll have to ask for you to be patient. And that's fine. but the editor should be communicating. And if this goes on for much more than 6 months, well, you see what the editor has to say. And if the editor is communicating with you and you're okay with waiting, okay, that's fine. But I wouldn't let it go much more than 6 months. And if you're not happy with you're not getting communication, you're not happy with what's going on, then you'd be justified in withdrawing the paper.
Okay. So apparently we have one more question.
Sure.
Just came in. It's from Tias from Universitas Terbuka. What if we have published in a predatory journal? It is so unfortunate, but what should we do? Retract it or just move on? Thanks for your
Move
answer.
on, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot of people do publish in predatory journals unknowingly. And some people publish in predatory journals knowingly. What's happened sometimes is that people will have a list of articles. And so if you've got 30 articles and 3 or 4 of them are in predatory journals, you're kind of hoping that when your university reviews your production, your curriculum vitae, they'll just say, oh yeah, there's 30 articles, that's good. But if a university is actually paying attention to the quality of the journal, then it will probably not do you any good. You need to find out what your university's policies are. But at the National University of Singapore, they have some standards for what is considered acceptable. And they actually tell people, if you have published something, and this is not even predatory journals, but in weak journals, don't even bother to send it to us. Don't send us, just take it, don't report that. So you find out what your university's policies are. But it is worthwhile avoiding the predatory journals.
Okay. All right. I think we have no more question for now. Anything more from the floor? I'm giving a chance. If there's no more question, okay. So we'll just wrap it up. So we have now come to the end of today's workshop. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank our speakers today, Paul Nerny and Paul Kratoska, for the fruitful presentations that I believe are very useful for every participant. Also for the suggestions, recommendations, and strategies that I think all participants can apply in their writing process. Also for the participants, thank you for your enthusiasm. Thank you for your questions. And before we close today's session, allow me to remind you for tomorrow's session. So the first session will start at 6:30 p.m. until 7:30 Western Indonesian time, discussing several topics revolving around what reviewers look for, responding to referees' reports, and choosing the right journal, led by Siddharth Chandra. And the second session will start at 7:30 p.m. until 8 p.m. Western Indonesian time, discussing the topic Why Your Dissertation is Not a Book, led by Paul Kratoska. And at 8 p.m. until 9:30 p.m. Western Indonesian time, there will be an introduction to individual consultation for workshop participants only. And then you'll begin your one-on-one session with workshop presenters, and each participant will be assigned a time. And once again, thank you. We hope to see you again tomorrow. Stay safe and healthy.